Welcome back, everyone. We are here for day 9 of the Certified Cloud Security Professional Bootcamp brought to you by GoCloud Careers. Most of you know me at this point. My name is Mike Gibbs. I'm the CEO of GoCloud Careers. I am joined here by our Chief Technology Officer, Mark Milovanovic. Mark is as much of a techie as you can ever find that loves to dive deep into all kinds of details. We are lucky to have him as part of our organization. He's also a Cisco certified internet expert and knows a lot about cybersecurity. So that's kind of the things we're talking about right now. And we're going to get back to the 9th day of this, believe it or not. In case you just joined us and it's the first day, because things happen, sometimes you get notified by YouTube at odd times. We have a free accompanying ebook that we actually wrote for you that I'd love you to just download. And when I'll turn it over to Mark in a minute, he'll tell you what page we are on that book so you can work alongside us along the way. My team wanted to make sure you were fully prepared for this significant course and exam. So hope that helps. We also have a webinar once per week where we talk about how to become an architect, like a cloud architect or a network architect or an AI architect or an enterprise architect. We have webinars for a lot of these things. So join us. There's all free. I'll have my team drop a link on how to become a cloud architect in that team as well, because if it's your first architect job, I think you'll like it. You'll learn what we do, the real skills we need, and the things that you need to know to be good. And that way you'll actually be properly trained for the job you want. Now, I'm having fun talking about this CCSP content. I've been in cybersecurity now for almost 25 years. I love it. Most of my cybersecurity days were more network security based because I'm more of a network architect, but I've spent lots of time in cybersecurity. I absolutely love it. And that's what we're doing, and it's free. As we talked about, there's a shortage of 4.7 million cybersecurity professionals, and there's even a critical more shortage of cybersecurity architects, network architects, AI architects, cloud architects, enterprise architects. So lots of opportunities in great fields. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark. Mark will reorient you to where we are in the content, go over through all the important materials, and then we'll get back to the fun.
I appreciate that introduction, Mike. I can't believe we're on day 9 of our boot camp. I mean, if you all agree with me, give me a hashtag CCSP if you believe when you're having fun, time just flies. I mean, even when we were discussing some of this, I guess if we consider a little bit more like dry content, like the governance and the compliance, things that we generally always have to have some kind of counsel with us. It's still interesting to see how that architect role gets developed, that it's really a planning type of role.
Yeah.
So I genuinely hope that everyone has enjoyed it so far. And we got some fantastic things planned for everybody today as well. We'll continue off with some management principles before we dive into some more privacy in the cloud. We're going to look at some cloud forensics. And then eventually we'll get into cloud vendor management. This is the part of the actual exam that's going to deal with security policy frameworks, risk management, risk treatment, and risk analysis. And then also we're going to have to discuss, since this is really part of cloud vendor management, is the communication. How do you communicate, and what manner communicate with the third parties? Because it's not always just going to be the cloud vendors. There's additional parties you may have to communicate with, depending on, let's say, if you have some type of next generation firewall. What if you're including within your security policy, let's say you're running some type of SASE cloud, or you're running some type of SD-WAN with security as a service. So there's a bunch of different things that we'll learn here, and I think everybody's going to enjoy it. Yeah. Now, to kind of orientate ourselves a little bit, if you've not downloaded yet the study guide, that's the actual complement to this particular bootcamp where you can follow along. You can use it as a study guide. You can use it as a slide deck as we go along. I invite you to turn to page 373 of the study guide. And there we're going to pick up with the next topic called management principles. Mike, I'll hand it back over to you. And then in maybe about 20 to 30 minutes, let's see what type of wonderful questions everybody has. And we'll see how much geeky we can get with governance, compliance, and legal in general.
That actually sounds all kinds of geeky, and we can get pretty geeky there. But right now we're discussing management principles. So welcome back. Let's have some fun. Give me a hashtag CCSP so I know you are awake, alert, and oriented. I guess the alternative is AAO times 3, but unless you're a medical profession, please give me the CCSP. All right, Tyrone, it's time. I'm going to go back to the content. So let me have to lower myself on the screen. We've got this batter here, and I need to just change where I'm at so my head's not cut off. And then we'll begin with regards to management principles. So we have to define documents, communications, and assign accountability for things along with privacy as we're going along. Recall yesterday we were talking to privacy, and we talked about the 10 gap principles. And honestly, maybe I'll start with that. So we talked about generally accepted privacy principles, and we talked about these privacy principles being accepted to create a framework, like a global type framework for privacy management. And it was originally developed by the American Institute of Chartered Public Accountants, go figure, and the Canadian Institute of Chartered Accountants. And they were here to come up with a way to establish privacy when transferring information. And yesterday we alluded to these 10 gap principles are management, notice, choice and consent, collection, use, retention, and disposal, access, disclosure to third parties, security for privacy, quality, and monitoring enforcement. So those were what we were talking about in terms of principles. And now, when we go back into that management principle perspective, you can see that it's covering documents, communications, and it's going to sign up accountability for the privacy and the policies. Now, there's a criteria for management control. And what has to happen here is you have to create a written policy, written privacy policies, and you have to communicate these privacy policies to the personnel inside of your organization. So that has to happen. It's going to be necessary to assign responsibility and accountability for these policies to someone inside of your organization, someone inside of your team. It'll be absolutely critical as part of these management principles to establish procedures for reviewing and approving privacy policies and changes when they're occurring. And it's going to ensure that privacy policies are going to be consistent with applicable laws and regulations. So coming up with these management principles of, making sure that people have to follow a certain set of rules, it's to make sure that the proper procedures are followed. So according to maintain these management principles, it's necessary to perform annual privacy risk assessments to make sure things are good and they're operating appropriately. These management principles are there to ensure that any contractual obligations to customers, vendors, or third parties are going to align with privacy policies. So it's about assessing privacy risks when implementing or changing technology or infrastructure. And it's creating some form of a policy incident. So the whole point of managing this is what we're dealing with is who can speak to whom. What level of security do each of the partners need to actually have with each other? And then if and when any of the partners get compromised and it affects information, it's the ability to notify others. So that's what we're talking about, management of privacy. Now, if privacy has been breached, or in many cases, organizations need to share their privacy policies with you. So the definition going back to those 10 gap principles are that it's going to require organizations to inform individuals about their privacy practices. And the entity will have to provide notice about its privacy procedures, and it's going to have to identify the purposes to which your personal information is collected, used, retained, and disclosed. You may notice when you sign up to do with a business, you have to sign a privacy policy or see the privacy policy or something to that effect. Now, in notice, there's going to be a criteria. So what does that mean? It means there's going to need to be a notice of the practices inside of a privacy policy, and individuals will need to be notified if personal information is being collected about them and the privacy policies of that organization. There needs to be, they need to write a policy, and ideally the policy should be written in plain and simple language, and it should be posted conspicuously for everyone to use. Now, I don't know about you. I haven't seen many policies that are actually posted in conspicuous language, but that's one of the criteria for these privacy notices. And then with regards to choice and consent, that allows individuals to retain control over their personal information. And this entity really is going to describe, the choices that'll be available to the person. And that contains to anything related to the collection. So I kind of hope that makes sense so far. Anthony out there just passed your CCSP today. Congratulations. We are so happy for you. Glad you were here as well. So when there's a criteria for everything, so the criteria for choice and consent is that choice and consent practices, evaluating where the data is going to go, etc., and who's allowed to consent to it, has to be in the privacy policy. Individuals need to be informed about available choices and options, the things they can consent to, as well as the consequences for refusing to do so or withdrawing consent. Meaning that you may give an organization consent for your information, and you may withdraw that consent later. So what does that organization have to do when you withdraw your consent for that information? And there's a need to obtain implicit or at least explicit consent at the time or before personal information is being collected. So that's why you're seeing various privacy policies when companies are going to ask you information. You may also, under this choice and consent area, need to notify individuals of proposed new rules for previously collected information, assuming things change along the way. You may need to obtain direct consent when collecting, using, or disclosing sensitive personal information. And you may need to obtain consent before transferring personal information to an individual's computer or device. So, are you starting to feel like these privacy rules have a lot of rules? There's rules related to its management. There's rules related to the way the information is being shared. There's rules related to the notifications that you need to tell people. And now there's going to be rules related to the way the data is collected. And that's going to determine or govern the way that organizations can actually come into possession of personal information. See, the entity may collect personal information for certain purposes, and that's going to need to be identified in the notification. Now, of course, for collection, there is obviously there's another set of criteria that the policy needs to meet, and that means it needs to include collection practices and privacy policies. Individuals will need to be informed their information is being collected for identified purposes, and it's going to have to detail the way the organization's collecting data, the types of data they collect, and that also needs to be in their privacy notice. So collecting information is going to have to be done via fair and lawful means. And that's going to have to, and its purposes will need to be identified in the policy. We also need to ensure that any third parties providing personal information or that have collected it got it fairly and legally, and that the information we're using is reliable. And we have to inform individuals if additional information about them is somehow obtained. So lots of rules related to privacy. Now, we talked about the use and retention and disposal. And really, this is about ensuring the privacy of personal information throughout its life cycle. So the entity, the organization, will limit the amount of personal information for the purpose that were identified already. And they have to put that in the notice. But the organization or the entity may retain personal information, and they're going to keep it as long as it's necessary. And it's necessary for them to fulfill their business as required by law or regulations or thereafter. So you may have a hospital, they're being forced to retain their information for 6 years or 7 years. Well, they're required by law to do so, but after they're going to dispose of it, how do they dispose of it? How do they dispose of that data properly? So, of course, there's obviously a criteria related to use, disposal, and retention of data. So that criteria needs to be detailed, and the disposal practices in the privacy policies. Individuals will have to be informed that personal information will only be used for the disclosed purposes and the information disclosure you give them. So I'm going to take your information, and I'll give you an example. We'll be collecting your information, your past medical history, or other records, so I can use this in the context of your patient care. Not so I can start selling you insurances later, not so I could register you as part of a study. It all is a matter of those things that it's being disclosed for. So I hope that makes sense. And of course, individuals will also need to be known that their data will be retained only for as long that's necessary. Now let's talk about the access side, what's going on into these privacy policies. So that's about granting access or people access to the information that is collected by that organization who have a need or right to see that information. So the entity itself has to provide an update as to what information is being seen for review. So a lot of rules here. I can delegate that the doctor and the nurse can see this information. And that's fine. That's what we're talking about with regards to access. I'm giving access to those people that need it in the course of that patient's care. But the organization itself will have to provide access to the personal information that being reviewed and updated to the people that need it, but not everybody else. So of course, there's going to be a criteria of access in your policy. And that's going to include that you have to include access and how the data is going to be accessed or used in your privacy policies. Individuals will have to be informed about procedures for reviewing, updating, or collecting, or even correcting personal information. There needs to be a mechanism for individuals to determine if an organization is going to hold their personal information and review it. And individuals need to be authenticated, meaning you have to know who they are before you give access to them. So just because I say I'm Mike, maybe they need to prove that I am Mike Gibbs instead of just somebody else pretending to be Mike Gibbs. So with regards to access, we have to provide access to information in an understandable format within a reasonable time for either no fee or a reasonable cost. Individuals need to be informed in writing. If we have to inform individuals in writing, if we need to access their information or update information or something like that and give them appeal rights. And organizations have to offer a mechanism for individuals to be able to update and correct personal information. For example, maybe something's wrong in one of the records and that information is being disseminated to third parties, and that could cause a problem. Maybe a patient notices a wrong medical diagnosis is in their chart, and that's getting sent to 3 different hospitals that are going to be taking care of that patient's care. That's a problem, and that's what we're talking about, correcting bad information. Now, of course, you're collecting information, right? What about disclosing that information to third parties? So that is another thing that's needs to be addressed as part of these privacy policies, and that's about managing privacy issues when sharing personal information with third parties. So the organization must disclose that if personal information is going to be given or third parties, and it needs to be explicitly the consumer or the user needs to be explicitly notified, and they have to provide some form of consent. Sure, you can share my information with third parties. So you may notice if you go to a doctor's office and they ask you to sign a few forms, please allow us to send this information to your insurance company so they may pay on your behalf for the medical services rendered. May I disclose this information to your parent or guardian or to your spouse? That's that disclosure to third parties. And the third party could be a spouse. The third party could be a pharmaceutical company. The third party could be a lot of things, but that's really what we're talking about in terms of giving information. And if you're going to give it to a third party, someone has to just say that, yes, it's okay. So that means that if an organization is going to be sending information to third parties, that needs to be disclosed in their privacy policies. That's one of the criteria. Another criteria is to inform individuals about third-party disclosures and their purposes. Another criteria for disclosure to third parties is requiring third parties receiving the personal information to comply with the organization's policies and privacy policies. So that means if you're going to be sharing information and you've got a specific privacy policy sharing it with these people need to follow your security policy. So it's this web of trust that's going around from every time you need to share information. Some other criteria for disclosure is that personal information to third parties is not going to occur without notice unless it's provided by law. So, for example, you may have an individual's business information and somebody wants it. You can't give it out. But if you're subpoenaed by the court, you may have to give it to law enforcement, for example. Now, there also needs to be under disclosure. You have to an organization has to implement procedures to verify the effective functioning of third-party privacy controls. So, if you're an organization and you're using third-party privacy controls or other things or applications or devices or something, you have to test to make sure they're actually doing their job as well. And if you're dealing with another company that deals with data, a third party, and they don't do something well, you have to take remedial action if another party handles personal information or if they share it. So let's talk about security for policy. Security for privacy. So, security for privacy is about ensuring the protection of personal information from unauthorized access. And that could be physical or logical. Steal a hard drive or just get online. And when an organization has to protect individuals' personal information or customers' personal information, the entity is there to protect it from unauthorized access. So when we're dealing with security for privacy, we have to have security practices put in our privacy policies. And again, and we have to inform individuals about the organization's precautions to protect their personal information. So when we're dealing with security for privacy, there's a criteria. And that's about developing and documenting and implementing a security program and addressing key privacy-related concerns. Now, most of these privacy concerns you'll see in the ISO 27002, and that's related to risk assessment and treatment and organization security policy, and organization of information security, asset management, human resource sharing of information, physical and environmental security, communications and operations management, access control. And there's a reason I'm going through this list. Information systems acquisition, development and maintenance, information security incident management, what happens in an incident, business continuity management, compliance. That's a lot of stuff that we just talked about, right? The things that are in that privacy criteria and that are going into policy, a lot of that stuff is the architecture piece. In order to secure this, we have to do this, which means we have to do this, which means we have to do this, which means we have to do this. We have to do this from an architectural perspective to support these goals and the policies. So we have the policy. The policy says we have to do some kind of third-party verification. The architecture needs to have some way that it can do third-party verification, either human-wise, manual-wise, or technology-wise, or some combination of the both. The policy says we need to have some secure form of encryption that's deemed secure by the government. That means, maybe right now it's AES 256 for stores, but maybe it goes up later and then we follow it. So the policy is driving the architecture, and that's why most of what we architects do is at that policy level. We're so high up on that food chain with regards to what we're doing, because if we go into the build, if we go into the implementation, if we go into any of this without answering the right questions, we never achieve our goals. And that's why 70 to 80% of these solutions fail. So that's why there's so many things that need to go in there. Now let's talk about quality as it pertains to personal information. Quality is about making sure that personal information is accurate, that it's complete, and it's relevant for all the reasons it's been notified. If a bank has your personal information, your name, your address, your social security number, your bank account number, and your bank balance, but your bank balance was going to be changed, that is hitting the integrity of the information. That is incomplete information about you. And that could harm you because your bank account balance could be changed lower. So that's private information, and the quality of that information needs to be, top notch. So that means that when we're dealing with security, when we're dealing with privacy, we now have to include things like data privacy practices and data quality practices and data hygiene practices. And that means they're also going to need to go to the privacy policy. So, data quality, privacy policy, and security. Data quality, AI and inferences and recommendations to the business. Data quality and generative AI. Data quality and agentic AI. Data quality and business intelligence systems. It all matters. It's all the same stuff. And that's why when you're in one form of architecture or another form of architecture, you're going to end up asking the same questions. Much the same way that if you went to one doctor, they'd ask you a series of questions, and then they send you to a specialist, and they're going to start with the same questions all over again and then get deeper. It's the same thing that we're dealing with. So I'm hoping you're feeling this repetition. I hope you're feeling that this feels like we talked about it before, and we talked about it in another section, and we talked about it in another section, we talked about it in another section, because we did. Because that's all architecture is. Every little thing, how it impacts everything else, and we keep going back to try to tie these pieces together. So going back to the criteria for quality in our privacy, we have to make sure individuals know it's their responsibility to provide accurate and complete personal information. And if there's an issue and the person notifies it, they need to tell that entity or that organization, there's a problem with my data, please fix it. Now, anytime we've got data, anytime we've got a privacy policy, in some way we need to know that we're following it, right? That we didn't break it, that things didn't go wrong, right? So we need some monitoring and enforcement. And that means we need to ensure the ongoing effectiveness and compliance to our privacy practices. Okay, we architects and business leadership put up the practices. Now are people following them? Is it working? That's what we're talking about monitoring. Enforcement is more, okay, these are the practices and somebody's not following them. So this person gets educated, this person gets reprimanded, this person gets terminated based upon how bad they are at what they're dealing with, or whether it's accidental or malicious. So I kind of hope that helps make sense what we're trying to deal with. So for monitoring, the criteria for monitoring going to be as such. Our privacy policy has to have some kind of monitoring inside of it and enforcement practices. Our privacy policy has to have some way to inform individuals about the correct procedures for questions, complaints, or disputes on any part of the privacy policy. Our privacy policy has to have a dispute resolution process that'll address any type of potential complaint that could occur. And we have to review these compliance and privacy policies with procedures, laws, regulations. There's some more criteria regarding monitoring and enforcement of developing and implementing remediation plans anytime you see something that didn't go right. Documenting any instances of privacy policy violations and then doing something about it. And constantly performing ongoing monitoring of the privacy program in your risk assessment. I think I'm going to pause it there and see if there's any quick questions that popped up. This is it can kind of get heavy, some of these things. It really can. And I'm wondering if you're starting to see, you're hearing how many things that I'm talking about that have to go into this policy? I mean, architects could spend 6 months on this, but it's more than that. Now we're getting pretty deep and pretty geeky into legal and compliance issues. How many of you would know how to write a 500-page legal contract? So, that's the point. Even as architects, we're going to do things, we're going to build our teams, but at some point we're going to have to get to that legal perspective for these kind of reasons, because some of this stuff is just going to be outside of our career.
All right. It looks like we do have a question that came in, and let's hope our standard response to that is not going to be consult, but let's take a look. So from Alan, he's wondering, is it standard in a privacy policy that the information will be shared, or for example, is it mandatory to be shared with the big 3 credit bureaus So he's describing the 3 big credit bureaus within the United States, which are going to be TransUnion, Experian, and of course, Equifax. So is it standard privacy policy that will be shared? Not necessarily, Alan. It's all going to depend on the actual circumstances in regards to how it has to be provided. There was an example I gave yesterday. There was when there was a breach detected, and I didn't want to go into details how Experian, for example, found out that the breach was there, but it did have to deal with identifiable information. And I know we haven't touched yet on the criteria of identifiable information, but we'll actually get into that in a couple of minutes. So when stuff like that happens, there has to be a lot of legal proceedings in making sure that what information does get released, and this includes the credit bureaus, that it's to some point sanitized, at least from that perspective. It's another thing, of course, if the information was stolen and so forth, we can't do much about that at that point, but whatever goes out to the public on purpose does have to be sanitized. So it just really depends on what the legal ramifications are going to be. In that case, you'll see things happening like what happened with AT&T when they had their huge breach. Well, actually, I probably should define which huge breach, because AT&T this year has been on fire when it comes to breaches. But they had a breach where they didn't want to tell for a few months what happened, and they had to get counsel from their actual legal team, which in then essence actually got a hold of the FBI, and then that went through an investigation, and then eventually some information got released. So there's always a particular process, but that's also going to depend on what your legal team is in the end going to consult you on doing.
Yeah.
All right, let's take a look at our next question. From Cloudy, are the management principles based on the CIA triad principles?
Not really.
So,
not really, but let's talk about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That's data, how you would deal with data in any environment or system. You'd want the information that's private to be private. You want your data to be what it's supposed to be, and you want your systems to be up and running. So what does that take? That takes a high availability design. That means multiple power, multiple devices, multiple cooling systems. It means multiple routers and switches, multiple routers and switching paths. It means routing protocols that can adapt. It means redundant servers. It means redundant storage. It means everything. On top of that, it'll take micro segmentation of the network to achieve some of these things. It'll take identity and access management. It's going to take encryption. It's going to take everything. So confidentiality, integrity, availability takes an end-to-end security architecture. These management principles are specifically related to someone's personal information. But the big but is, what's it going to take to secure private information? In some degree, many of the same things that it's actually going to take to create the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So they're going to feel in some way, shape, or form relatively similar, because they are. But if we think of a private VLAN, for example, which is having a VLAN, well, actually, if we take a virtual LAN, that existed, long before the modern virtual machine. Then we had something called the private VLAN, where we had two devices that couldn't talk to each other on a VLAN unless you asked them to. And then 10 years later, we had a container, which was two devices on the same operating system that couldn't talk to each other unless you wanted them to. So what you're going to see is these repetitive patterns again in the way technology systems are designed and what they're trying to achieve. So it's going to feel similar, but no, they're not based on it. But I'm glad you're starting to sense that the similarity. That's good.
Okay, great. Let us take a look now at what other questions we have. And this one is from Kennedy. He's wondering, since information security is key and compliance with regulatory framework is sacrosanct, I think it means sacred, how do we handle aggrieved key staff who may have been feeling dissatisfied?
Okay, so I've got a little experience here, and the further you move into management, the more you're going to have to be dealing with it. It's all about your level of emotional intelligence and your empathy. Mark, have you ever seen me actually yell, scream, lose my temper, get aggressive, or anything?
No, that's not your style.
It's not my style, so there's a reason for it. Life is never going to be easy. There's always going to be some level of frustration, but if you can stay in control, if you can look at something from the other person's perspective and wonder how you would feel if you were in their same circumstances after experiencing the same thing, in most cases, you can diffuse situations. Not always, in most cases. And in most cases, if you have good communication skills, I mean good ones, you'll be able to truly relax them. You combine that with a little bit of leadership skills and a little bit of an understanding of behavioral psychology. And by the way, I teach all this to our students in our cloud architect programs and enterprise architect programs and tech leadership programs. You'll pretty much be able to walk around 99% of the time and protect yourself. And the rest of the time, they have the military and they have the police to protect us when those kind of things don't work. But honestly, I can tell you, in a lot of times, people would tell me, Mike, the person is really hard. They're really frustrated. They're unreasonable. And I'd say, let me talk to them. A couple minutes later, the relationship's repaired. They buy more stuff from the company, and it's just about it. So I'd say try to be as empathetic as possible. Try to feel how you would feel if you were that customer or that client that was in a similar situation. Would you feel like them? And if so, what would you want to feel like the problem's been fixed for you? And that's kind of the way I try to treat it, because not everybody else is in your situation. Anybody's going to be in a different situation. And if Mark and I went to different schools, which we did, we speak different languages in our home, and we eat different food. He eats more of that, Eastern European. I eat more of those Mediterranean things because we're both from that part of the world, but a little bit more. Well, actually, we both don't because we're on specialty diets, but that's neither here nor there. But with our different education, we're going to view things differently. So I would try to see how would Mark see things with what Mark's experience in his life. Would he understand? And then communicate in an open, honest, authentic, and mean it to what you would want if you were that person, and then go solve things on their behalf if and when you can.
Yep. It's always going to be a somewhat tailored approach. One size doesn't always fit everybody. So that's something that if you ever do get in a position where you got to work with people or lead them, that you have to keep that in mind. They have a saying in the United States is just because the nail is sticking out, you don't hit it on the head. Generally speaking, that's what people do to think that one tool can be used for everything, and that's not always the case. Let's take a look at our next question here. And this one is from SR. He's saying, as per GDPR, the Europeans can sue the companies if their personal identifiable information data is exposed, but in the United States, customers cannot do anything by law in such cases. Is that true? If yes, then why? SR, it's not that simple when it comes to these laws. Like, for example, with what you're talking about it is personal identifiable information, and you have the right to sue for damages if you can show evidence that it's due to a data breach. So that is true within the European Union. In the United States, what happens is, because we have this concept that the power between the federal and the state is supposed to be separated, and then per the Constitution, there are certain rights that are granted to the states to take care of compared to the actual federal government. And that's why it's not as uniform as it is across, let's say, something like the European Union. So in the case of the United States, the steps that you would take are going to be the same in regards to that you will need to gather evidence so that you can prove that the data breach actually took place to begin with. Let's say we bring it back to like cloud security in that sense. And then what would have to happen is, depending under what jurisdiction you are. So now we're talking about the state. That's where you would have to take a look at first, what are the local laws? Perhaps instead of going the way where you are going to go through some type of lawsuit that's going to be encompassing multiple regions, you'll have to go through generally it's the attorney state general in that state. And then you would work it through there. But it's not as simple as I can tell you. For example, look at Article, I think it's like 80 or 82, whatever it is in the GDPR articles, that you can, if you can prove it, you can go ahead and you can sue. It's not as, unfortunately, black and white when it comes to the United States.
And there's a lot of other implications. So in Europe, people don't sue each other for no reason. Nobody goes to McDonald's, gets a hot coffee, spills it on themselves, and then sues McDonald's because the coffee was hot. I mean, they just don't do that. So, two cars get in a car accident in Greece and people yell and scream at each other for a minute and they go about their day and they fix their cars. It's not like that. So in Europe, it's not a major risk. If people started suing companies in the US, well, I can tell you what would happen the next day. The companies would then have to spend more on cybersecurity, more on cybersecurity insurance. And the next thing you realize, your prices are double. So I hope people aren't start suing companies if and when their data is done, unless some harm comes, because it's just going to increase the price of everything. Anytime, and you can see it in medicine, somebody comes into the hospital and they have what the doctor knows is a cold or an upper respiratory infection that's viral. But here's the thing. In the unlikely event that person was having a heart attack at the same time, and that was the reason they had chest pain, the hospital will run $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 a test on that person. And they'll do it to every person that comes in with a cold all day, every day. And they'll do it. And that way, when a patient says the hospital, they say, oh, we scanned for everything. We didn't find anything. So I hope you understand the implications of both sides of it. Nothing is free. So architecturally, we could do it. We could start suing people over information disclosures, and then the price of everything doubles. And then the next thing you realize, people can't afford anything, and then they ask for money, and then we have inflation going up. So all these things are cycles. One thing impacts another. So well, I guess we'll see.
I suppose we can say culture does have something to do with the local laws as well. I mean, I can tell you this. I was not born and raised in the United States. So there were certain things for me also that were very foreign that, like Mike used the example of the coffee was hot. It's common sense that you would know that the coffee is hot.
Mm-hmm.
So if I spill it, and I use the term I specifically,
exactly,
how am I going to go and then claim that the business is at fault because I spilled the coffee? Maybe call it the European in me that thinks that way, but not everybody's going to think the same way. And that's why you need certain protections around, because there's people that will try to take advantage to make some quick money and just abuse the system. So unfortunately, that's where even when it comes to the security, as we talk about, that's why we're moving also to this trust kind of system, where based on context, we're going to allow more privileges, more things that somebody can do compared to others. So it's a very similar concept in real life as it is in the security aspects.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a look at our next question here. It is from Kennedy. He's wondering, what security risk does such a staff pose to the security and safety of information?
A lot.
Yeah. I'll mention one. I'll let Mike mention a couple of two. I would probably say the first thing is think of it like human error. I mean, that's the first thing. Unfortunately, nobody is perfect of us. So if we have humans that are going to look towards something that is a little bit more, what's a good word to use? I don't want to use the word, but something that's going to be a bit more easier for them to manage, then think of it something like they're going to pick a password that they can remember. They're not going to pick a password, let's say, for example, that is going to have 16 characters, is going to have special characters on top of that, uppercase, lowercase, letters. They're going to pick something that they can remember. And if they cannot remember, you know what's going to happen then? They'll start writing it like in a notepad. And I am not exaggerating. I've seen this. They'll put it right on the monitor, on the keyboard.
Yep.
And if you've ever worked in an office environment, you know that third-party staff comes in. There's people that come in, they clean the facilities. It's very easy to take a look. They may not necessarily be the ones that are going to have malicious intent, but what if they take that and they just by accident mention it to somebody, and then that somebody takes advantage of it? I've been in other circumstances where we as humans were very trusting. Just to give you this little example, and when you have, at least in the United States, you have unsolicited sales calls that come around even to businesses. I mean, what if this is a person that is coming to your business and they're trying to do reconnaissance? They're trying to see what your weaknesses, what your strengths are. And you are the person that introduces yourself to them, tells them hi, brings them in, talks about it. So definitely, I would say one of the risks that you can have from staff that is very trusting and that potentially is also dissatisfied is that they'll do errors that are uncommon. And those are the physical errors. Others could be anything from they purposely are going to do misconfigurations because they're sick and tired of the job. They don't care anymore.
Yep.
They're not going to pay attention to detail. Just, simple things like that, that definitely a person like that can cause issues in an organization.
Yeah, all of that's right. And of course there's mistakes that can occur in the tech, but more important, it's just people want to talk.
Yep.
So what you'll find as you move up in your career, Kennedy, especially if you move into very senior roles, is you're going to have a lot more information. So, for example, in my architecture career, when I was a principal architect, it was Mike. These are the new features we're going to be designing in the next 6 months. These are the problems we have on these devices, just so you know about it. This is what the biggest companies and the biggest CIOs in the industry is doing. Here's what our pipeline is for the next 3 months. Don't tell any of the other architects in the company unless anybody else is under NDA. And then as you would go down, each person would have access to less and less information. That was the principle. That was the need to know, which is similar to the principle of least privilege. You walk into any company, the EVPs and up, most likely they're working on things that are 5 and 10 years out that they can't even talk about, that are top secret projects. And then you get to the VP level, they may be working on things that are 2 years in and out. And that's where we're at. At the CIO level, it's upwards of 20 years in some companies. So the amount of information is going to be shared typically between the CEO and the COO and very few other people in the CFO. Because people will leak information. And sometimes, I used to, when I'd go out there and I started my career and I was building a team, I would intentionally try to lease something that sounded like gossip and release it with various people, different forms of gossip, to see who was going to be the gossiper, so I could see who we could trust and who we could not trust. But you'd be surprised how fast people gossip.
Yep, definitely. Let's take one more question before we move on back to the content. This is from Kennedy. He's wondering, are there regulatory frameworks governing artificial intelligence, since some tech roles are going to be taken over by AI? Kennedy, there is in Europe, some laws came in. I don't recall at the top of my head what those were. I would have to look them up for you, what they are. When it comes to the United States, there was I think this was just a few months ago, that the president requested their cybersecurity chief to start looking into drafting standards when it comes to AI. And then eventually those will be brought about by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Unfortunately, though, because that is so early in the draft, and now with the change in leadership in the United States, there is no official framework for that is provided by the government. But once everything gets a little sorted out, I take it it's probably going to take a few months, if not to at least a year. Then once those frameworks come out, you can be sure that those are going to be publicized beyond belief, because it's almost like, and I don't use this in a weaponizing sense, but it almost feels like that because of AI and the implications of it, that AI has become this new kind of arms race between the different countries.
It's exactly what it is.
You'll definitely hear when those frameworks are going to be ratified. The one for Europe, I'll look it up. If I can find it, I'll put it in the chat box. The one from the United States is not ratified at this point.
Yeah. And you have to look at what kind of policy put here. If a country makes an anti-competitive AI government regulatory framework, the only thing that's going to happen is another country with a less regulatory framework will crush it economically. So you're not going to see a lot of regulations. The whole point of this is productivity enhancement and things. So it's okay. Those of us that are in the industry can do plenty of jobs. Those people that are on hands-on tech roles, like engineers, they can move out of engineering roles. They can move into architect roles that can't be replaced. They can move into program management roles. They can move into leadership roles, or they can move into sales engineering roles or other things. So there's always going to be a place for workers. We used to have somebody that would blow a horn that would wake people up in the morning. That was a job. There used to be people that would push the button for you in the elevator. And I'm literally not joking. But as technology changed, those jobs went away and new jobs were created. So it's all about saying, if AI can code and AI can configure and I want to be in tech, Look at all the architecture I can do. Look at all the leadership I can do. Look at all the sales I can do. Look at the program management. Look at all those jobs that celebrate your humanity. We'll get back to the contact now, but I wanted to thank you that it's never a bad thing. It's just a different thing. And as long as you adapt and you overcome the challenges that are coming your way, you're always going to be good. All right, let's get right. Let me know that you're awake. What's that, Mark?
I just wanted to say briefly, I wanted to address the question from Cloudy that came in before I have you move back on. So she was asking in regards to, since we discussed the payment card information, I believe that's what it's called, the PCI, the ones that deals with secure payment systems, if that also applies to business such as restaurant, barbershop, etc. Cloudy, it applies to anyone who takes digital or electronic payment. All of it has to be compliant in that sense. Thankfully speaking, let's say a lot of these restaurants, let's say these are just your small kind of businesses. We're not talking about larger chains, but let's say smaller businesses, same with barbershop or salon, stuff like that. The nice thing for a lot of these type of people, they don't necessarily need to hire architects for this, because they're going to go for what we basically call like a black box solution, which basically means they're going to buy a vendor's proprietary solution. So I'll give you a very simple example. When I was more involved in the SD-WAN architecture, when we were dealing with the different SD-WAN vendors, they by default had compliances built in for these different standards. So somebody that was using their product really didn't have to worry about it from a perspective of the security and the networking side there. Now, if they're using a point of sale system, they'll have to work with that vendor too. And generally speaking, even those vendors are always compliance. But this is where you'll have those phases where you'll have to get somebody in there. They'll perform an audit to make sure you're compliant. And we'll get a little bit later into it as well, that you can find yourself in situations where information might be a bit sparse or rare. That's also a very common thing in the cloud, right? Because there is this shared responsibility model where sometimes outsourcing part of our infrastructure and being able to audit that type of infrastructure is not going to be always as feasible. So we'll have to look into the more specifics in regards to what type of business it is, how they're going to be using it. But in general, anyone who accepts electronic payments is required to be PCI compliant. If they're not PCI compliant, then they'll have to go another route to be able to take some type of payment. But in the United States, it is a must if you're going to do it. If you want to be compliant, of course.
Yeah.
All right. So for everyone, if you're following along, give us a hashtag CCSP. That gives us a little heartbeat or keep alive that you're still with us. Before I hand it over to Mike, he's going to start picking up in regards to direct identifiers. We'll get a little bit more into details of that. In the study guide, it's going to pick up at page 388, and you'll see it. It will deal with direct identifiers, indirect identifiers, anonymization, as well as privacy impact and assessment. So go ahead and pay attention. It's going to get a little bit nitty-gritty details as we go forwards with some of these legal issues that we have to go to, and we'll eventually cover also some additional categories and types of reports that you might be expecting. And then, like I mentioned, we'll get also into some of more details in regards to what to do when we have to collect evidence, chain of custody, and as well as when it comes to just doing audits. So with that, Mike, I hand it back over to you.
Sounds great. We are going to get back into direct identifiers, which is a bit geeky. But before we do, I'm learning this YouTube game. If you're having a good time with the video, if you can give it a like. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of new videos. All right, now let's talk about direct identifiers. So there are certain things that make it very easy to identify someone. Mike Gibbs. It's not that hard to find me. It really isn't. Now, it's a little harder in Manchester, England, where there's a whole lot of Gibbses. But it's not that hard to find Mike Gibbs because you know my name. Now, if you had my name and you had my birth date and you had my home address, you're pretty sure you're going to find Mike Gibbs. My home phone number, pretty easy. My mobile phone number, assuming I'm subscribed to something. And in some cases, my IP address will tell you who I am, specifically if I have a public IP address that's a static IP address in my own name. That's what's called direct identifiers. identifiers. And if a direct identifier gets out there, it becomes very easy to find out who the person is. Now, there are things called indirect identifiers. And individually, none of these things are that complicated. And it will make it hard to find you. But together, they can give you some information. For example, birthplace. If my birthplace is Nepetamos, Greece, and there's 10,000 people in Nepetamos, Greece, that's some information. Now, if you know that I'm born in or my family's from Nepetamos, Greece, and then you know that I live in Port St. Lucie, now let's how many people from Nepetamos, Greece live in Port St. Lucie, Florida? Not a lot. Maybe just our family. I'm not sure. So that's how you've got an incorrect identifier. They can get you some information. Mother's maiden name, birthplace, current location. Now I know more. First car you drove, birthplace, mother's maiden name. Gotcha. I know who you are. So that's what's called indirect identifiers. And too many indirect identifiers come out there and you get it. Now, how about a guy named Mike Gibbs that is a martial artist, that is a yoga instructor, that is a CCIE with an MBA that can practice medicine. Now, the nurse practitioner license active in Florida and a paramedic license in Pennsylvania. That none of those things by themselves are anything, but together it's a whole lot. So that's what we're talking about. Anonymization. So that's really going to be a process of getting rid of identifiers. So it becomes impossible or harder to notify people. So this could be required by certain jurisdictions, laws, or standards to protect information. Now, when it comes to an architecture, when it comes to anything, whenever we have a goal, you always have to do a couple of things. We have to figure out where we're going, and we need to figure out where we're at, right? Because if we don't know where we're at and we don't know where we're going, we have no idea how to get there. So we have to do a privacy impact assessment. And when we look at an organization's privacy policy, we have to look at it now. What is it right now? Is it working? Is it following industry standard frameworks? Is it good enough? But we have to figure out where we're at. So we have to look at an impact assessment. What do we have? Is it good enough? If we make a change, what will be the impact of that on the assessment? So, lots of things that can be done from here. And the purpose of doing it is just that, to find out where we're at and then figure out where we need to go, what we need to do. But the outcome here of the privacy impact assessment is a primary and analysis. And we need to identify how business practices handle the information. We need to think about it, and we need to describe the way the business is working today, that current business architecture, and its impact on legal as well as ethical privacy obligations. And we can't do that if we don't know where we're starting. Now, I'm briefly going to talk about cloud forensics and what is that. So the challenge is with cloud computing, we've got this decentralized information. So we've got data across potentially different geographic boundaries, geopolitical environments, and there's not exactly necessary an international standard on cross-border procedures. But we have to find a way under a forensic environment where we can look at something and we can see exactly what happened. And we need to make sure there's some scientific validity to our findings. So there's some standards on cloud forensics. And there's guides for collecting information, identifying information, preserving electronic information on devices. That should be in your book. I'm not going to go necessarily over each and every one of those ISO standards that covers it, but it's all about digital forensics. But remember, with the cloud, we've got this distributed environment, so the data could be located someplace different. How are we going to necessarily collect this information in context with other laws? Now, in an on-premises environment, I know where your data is. If I've got an on-premise environment in Port St. Lucie, Florida, that data is inside that building, most likely where the computers are in Port St. Lucie, Florida, on the cloud. Okay, I'm in Ohio, but Ohio copied it to another data center, which copied it somewhere else to another region. It's harder to figure out where your data is going to be. So sometimes data crosses international boundaries. So that's going to have an impact on data collection, especially with international laws. So maybe in some cases, you're going to have to capture detailed user activity records. Now, when it comes to cloud forensics, it's going to be pretty critical with vendor relationships and your contracts with your vendors. So service level agreements should specify where data is going to be collected and how it's going to be maintained and whose responsibility that would be between you and the cloud provider. We have to have some kind of authorization for forensic data to be retrieved from the cloud data center if needed. We have to have some kind of environment where that takes place in these contracts that we have that deals with these multi-tenant environments and the potential for accidentally collecting somebody else's information. So somebody break the federal law enforcement subpoenas certain information. They pull certain hard drives out of a cloud provider's data center, the cloud provider's data center storage, and now they give that to, say, another vendor, to federal law enforcement, for example. And now federal law enforcement has your data on that same hard drive as somebody else's data. So that's one of those things that needs to be addressed policy-wide for forensics. And it takes some level of cooperation from your cloud providers too. So, there's always going to be forensic questions by vendors, service categories. You need to be thinking about the way they're deployed. So in a traditional environment, here's how forensic data is usually collected. And it's from a single owner. It's pretty easy. Single data center, single owner. And you've got something on a hard drive. They need forensic data. You potentially could give them the drive. In many cases, what you can do is you create an image and you use a good image that's an immutable image that they can then take back to the original source. And you can show this is a bit by bit copy of the image. And that way you keep a copy for yourself. You give a copy for forensics. That could be done. And that's pretty easy to do in the data center. But in the cloud provider, some data collection and acquisition isn't just as easy. So you've got multiple owners of the resources because it's going to be the customer's resource, but it's owned by the provider, the cloud provider, because they're leasing it to you. There are there's complications from third-party data that's going to be in these shared infrastructures. So when it comes to forensically getting information from the cloud, you may need help of the cloud provider, or the law enforcement might. Now, there's always going to be some kind of legal and technical constraints that are around. So there are legal and technical limitations for customers to independently capture forensic data. So because of that, if an organization needs to collect forensic data, they usually need the help of the cloud provider. Now there are, they always talk about, standards such as the ISO 27037 and the 27042 for guidance on forensic data collection, preservation, or analysis. There's typically an expertise requirement here for forensic data and forensic capturing. So most cloud customers are going to lack the necessary skills for detailed forensic evidence collection. So the key here is to generally find credible, respected, licensed, or certified forensic professionals to do these cloud investigations. Now, evidence must also be preserved. So if information needs to be obtained by law enforcement or court, the evidence needs to be preserved. So there needs to be a method to track the evidence. So from the time the evidence is recognized to the time it's delivered in court or to law enforcement, there needs to be that custody of data. Who had it, who touched it, who modified it, who did what. Otherwise, the evidence is garbage. if it's not protected. So there needs to be some documentation around, individuals who accessed evidence, where the evidence was stored, any kind of protection or access controls applied, any modifications or analysis performed of the evidence, the chain of custody, meaning who touched it along the way, who got it or who inherited the evidence, who handled it, where were the handoffs. And it's going to be important, and whether it's a regular criminal activity and there's physical evidence, they do this. If it's digital evidence, we still need that same chain of custody. Nothing changed in standard laws versus the digital environment here for the most part. Because if you've got evidence, but it got lost along the way, let's say the police found evidence of a crime. They picked up the evidence. They distributed it somewhere. It was lost for 30 days, and then they found it again. Is that evidence going to be anywhere near as impactful as evidence was collected by this officer? It was stored by this officer, and it was pulled this day. Obviously, it's not, and that evidence can be impugned or impeached in court, making it irrelevant. So preserving evidence is going to be absolutely critical. Absolutely. And there should be a policy for collecting evidence, a chain of custody, and this should be developed. It should be developed with input of legal experts and specialized consultants, and discussed with your team, and making sure everybody follows it. And the point here is this concept of non-repudiation. I gave you an example where the evidence was lost for 30 days. Well, in 30 days, if the evidence lost, you could say, well, who knows? The evidence isn't real. It's been tampered with. It's been tainted. It's been who knows. So that's what you're trying to prevent. Let's talk briefly about e-discovery. So that's, realistically speaking, the process of identifying and obtaining electronic evidence for legal purposes. And with this, like anything else, there's going to be a challenge of determining what's relevant data and how to find it, especially in a cloud environment that's decentralized. In a multi-tenant environment, this is going to add some complexity as well, because, how do you get one person's data without intruding on somebody else's? So e-discovery, or obtaining information, is going to take some professional expertise. So it's hard to find people that are trained in e-discovery, and they're rare. And most organizations aren't going to employ them. So making sure that you've got experts in e-discovery or consultants that can actually do it are going to be key for you. And there's plenty of industry standards and guidelines, such as the ISO 20050, and there's other guidelines on e-discovery. Now, it also gets more complicated with regards to e-discovery, as there are legal and contractual considerations. And here we can have cloud customers must understand international laws, service level agreements, and contractual agreements. And people need to be concerned about the awareness of international legal boundaries as well, because that changes everything. Now, there are vendors that also offer products to meet e-discovery demands. So you may see software as a service e-discovery solutions that are out there, or provided by cloud vendors as well. You will see host-based tools for locating information on specific hardware and virtualized platforms to help with e-discovery. Okay, now let's briefly talk about audit processes, methodologies, and cloud adoption. So let's talk about an audit. What is an audit really? An audit is hiring someone, or having someone, against your will, one of the two, that is going to review and determine if your environment's what it's supposed to be, if it's compliant and meets all laws, rules, regulations, standards, configurations, what have you. And auditing in cloud environments is not so easy, because you don't have access to the traditional hardware like you would in a traditional data center. We previously talked about virtualized environments, and we talked about virtual machines. We talked about containers. We talked about all these virtual environments. Well, in the cloud, it's all virtual. So auditors are not actually getting into the exact hardware. They're getting into the software to a certain degree. And I kind of hope that's so. And then data center, I've got a hardware switch. I've got a hardware router. I can put a protocol analyzer off it and see all traffic moving through that device if I choose to, at least on a specific VLAN. And if it's a transit VLAN or something, I can see everything. And auditors, may have to rely on a management console on a cloud provider. And you've got an auditor that's an expert at pulling data. Now they're on the cloud and they don't know how to use the cloud. So it's not creating an great environment. And if we're going to have someone or employ someone to audit a cloud, they need to have hypervisor access and hypervisor knowledge, right? But they may not be able to see the hypervisor or may have to go to extremes to be able to see it. So there's lots of control mechanisms that need to be there. So anytime we're going to do an audit, what are we going to look at? So, I used to audit charts of patients often that had medical problems that had been going on for years. And people would send me these charts and say, Mike, we can't figure out what to do. And I'd read through, years and years of medical records. And I'd say, I missed it. Somebody missed this little thing and we can treat this little thing. It was great when you caught something. It's sad when you can't find someone and people are just struggling. But if you find something and you can fix it, it's like, oh, this is good. So same thing in an audit. The point of doing it is to be able to look and feel and see if you can fix it, make it better, improve it. But what are you going to audit? You're going to audit the entire world, boil the entire ocean? Or you're going to audit one thing? So we have to scope the audit the same way we would scope an architecture, what's in scope. And we have to determine what are going to be the elements in the audit, who's the participants in the audit, what systems will be involved in the audit. And we have to define the scope before the audit begins because we need to ensure clarity on the audit breadth, the duration, the amount of resources that are going to be used. And cloud audits typically focus on infrastructure, but they can focus on platform, or they can focus on applications, and it's going to be a lot dependent upon the service model you're actually using. So when we're dealing with SaaS audits, like a software as a service, like a Microsoft 365, we're not auditing the infrastructure at that point. And the cloud providers may be auditing their own systems, hopefully, and we can hope that they did a good job with it. But it's a very high level of abstraction in SaaS. That's software as a service, so there's not going to be much we can audit. Now, we're going to try and do an audit. What happens when we're in a geographic boundary? So we may confine the audit into just US or just EU or just Asia Pacific Rim, those kind of things. We may make the audit a simple state, a data center, one office, who knows? But we have to figure them out. And really got to consider geographic boundaries. Now, what do we do in architecture is going to tell you the same thing we do in response to an audit. So what do we do in architecture? We first find the business goals that need to occur. Then we understand the business architecture. Then we look at their current technology and see, will the current technology meet the needs of their business goals and their future business architecture? And if it does, we don't do anything. If not, here's our starting point. Here's our finishing point, and we need to create a gap analysis between them and figure out what those things are, those deltas, and then make those changes. What are we doing in an audit? The same thing. We're trying to see what we find. Here's our starting point. Here's where we need to go. Where is that gap analysis? So another case in architecture using a gap analysis. And whether we're architecting a business process, whether we're architecting a security policy, or whether we're architecting a technology system, that's all things architects do, and it all takes the same thing. Where are we trying to go? Where are we starting? And what do we need to do to get there? That's really where we're at. So we'll have to do the same kind of gap analysis, compare where we're starting, where we're ending, and determine what the gaps are. We'll have to document it. And then when we know what the gaps are, then as part of our remediation plan, we can figure out what we should do. Now, a good architecture at this level, a good plan at this level, isn't going to recommend a specific technology. It's going to say we need some form of encryption. And then you can evaluate what forms of encryption you could use along the way. We should protect this with 2 stages, next generation firewalls. It's not going to say to buy the Cisco one, the Palo Alto one, the Fortinet, or the Checkpoint one. at that point, you're getting down into those solution building blocks as opposed to those bigger, more sophisticated architectural building blocks. And at that point, you'll figure it out. You'll test them. You'll figure out which one best meets the needs of the business after evaluating all trade-offs. But always going to be doing these gap analysis. And the next thing that we want to talk about is scoping. So the auditor they may do it, or if the auditor is trying to audit too much, or they've been given insufficient information, they make scope limitations. Given access to this, I can only audit this, and this is what's been audited here. So we have to make sure the auditors got their ability to be able to render professional judgment, do their job, and document what they've done versus not done. All right, I think we talked about a lot about auditing and policies so far. Probably more to talk about policies, but let's, at least for right now, take some questions.
All right, let us take a look and see what questions we have available. From Cloudy, is anonymization similar to tokenization? They are related, but different. When you think of anonymization, think of that you're trying to hide or mask something. And in the sense of the CCSP and security, what that means, we're masking and we're removing any particular data so that it cannot be reversed. So that's the key there with anonymization. It cannot be reversed once you hide the information. Now, when it comes to tokenization, what we're doing there is we're taking the original data that we have and we're simply changing it up. We're adding some different type of information, and generally speaking, it's some type of cryptographic hash that helps bring out the particular string that we get with tokenization. But the key difference there is with tokenization, it generally has some reference back to the original information. So it allows us to actually do a reversal. So it's not a permanent change that we do with tokenization compared to anonymization. Very good question, Claudia. All right. Let us take a brief look at another question here from Cloudy. She's wondering, is there really a clear difference between personal identifiable information and direct identifiers? There is. And a way that I want everybody to think about this is when we're talking about personally identifiable information, you want to think of it, that's like your parent, that's your main category. So that means any type of information that could potentially identify an individual. Now, when we're talking about direct identifiers, that is a subset, meaning it's a child category of the personal identifiable information. Again, it's still something that can lead back to a person, but it's subsets of it. So for example, let's say we have information from a person and things such as names. In the United States, we have social security numbers. It could be things, anything biometric. Think about like iris scans, could be fingerprints, could be things like that. If you have information like that, you could find your way back to that person. But on the flip side, it becomes a little bit more difficult if you have something like an indirect type of information, like maybe a zip code in the United States. Maybe you have an address. That is a lot more difficult to pin down exactly who that individual is that you're looking for. So the biggest key here is to think of it, personal identifiable information is anything that can identify an individual, while direct is just a subset, like a name, social security number, fingerprint, things like that. And let me know if that explains it as well, Cloudy, these concepts. And then we'll see if we can tie it back to your third question eventually. But let's take a look at our next question here, Tyrone. So this is from Scooby. Development and maintenances of relationships with all these aspects and the people who pull the necessary strings in covering all the aspects of the architecture role, correct? Does this help your job security? I'm going to let Mike touch on, you want to touch first on the job security? And then
let me,
perspective on it.
Let me talk about why the architect is one of the most secure jobs and why these elements equal job security. So these are the elements that are going to determine your job security. Do you bring money into the company or do you cost the money company? So if I work at IBM as a cloud architect and I sell $1 billion of architectures, or I sell a $50 million architecture, and there's a 50% margin on a $50 million architecture that I'm involved in, that company just made $25 million. So they love me. I'm bringing in money. Now, if I was the back end engineer that was writing the software code, I'm costing that company money. I'm not generating money. And that's why in times of layoffs, you typically take if you've got a software developer in California, you lay them off and you hire a software developer in, say, Bangalore, India, or you use AI. So there is that. So if you're customer facing and revenue producing, like a cloud architect, a solutions architect, a sales executive, you're typically much more resistant to being laid off if you're doing your job bringing in revenue. Now, the next thing that I can tell you is if you look at emotional intelligence training on the average person, not only are you more likely to get promoted and not fired during a layoff, but on average paying careers, it equals $29,600 more per year for people with higher levels of emotional intelligence. And once we go above that and get into the elite levels of emotional intelligence, for every 1% increase, there's a $1,200 US dollar increase per year. So that's just emotional intelligence. And why am I saying this? So when it comes to laying off, here's what companies do. Most companies, at least once, 2 times per year, they stack rank their employees from the best to the worst that they actually have. And then if they have to do a layoff and they have to cut 10%, what they do is this following. When they look at the best to work, they say, okay, who do we need moving forward? Revenue producing people, we don't lose. AI people right now, we don't lose. Cloud people, we can't afford to lose, or whatever the important things are. And then it will next then say, it'll say something else. It'll say, which people will we get rid of? And they're typically our least productive people in terms of work output. And they are our least likable people. They are the people that don't get in along and the people that are your generalized pain in the whatever. So at some point, if a company does 10 layoffs, they're going to ultimately get rid of all their good people at some point. But the key is they're the people that are let go first. Again, lots of good people can get cut off on layoffs, but for whatever reason, the company values people for a certain thing. They stack rack them, and the last they lay off in order of the people they perceive as their worst. And a lot of times, the people they perceive the worst are the ones that are the least emotionally intelligent, that are the worst personalities, that fly off the handle, that have a temper. So the answer is yes, it makes you so much better. Do I advise emotional intelligence training? Yes. I will tell you that I've had more emotional intelligence training because I had to learn it first. They called it therapeutic communication for taking care of patients. And then I took more and more and more emotional intelligence training. And probably what I spent on emotional intelligence training or companies have would cost as much as a new Mercedes. Do I recommend it? Yes. In our cloud architect programs and our enterprise architect programs, that we spend a tremendous amount of time developing emotional intelligence on our clients? Yes. We use traditional emotional intelligence tools, but we add other things because my perspective is, yeah, I can teach you emotional intelligence all day long, but what happens if you're in a stressful situation and you can't control your emotions? Then all of it's for naught. So I teach you the traditional ways to, at least our students, to manage their emotions and be more emotionally intelligent. Then I actually teach them cognitive behavior therapy to control their thinking. And cognitive behavior therapy is used from everything from Navy SEALs to Olympians to depressed patients, as well as other high performance people to control their thinking. And I even brought in a yoga instructor, of which I am one, but I brought in a better yoga instructor and a meditation coach to try to do this because, somebody wants to say something crazy. All of a sudden, there's something flying and I got to block it and I want to diffuse the situation. I need to be calm. And whether you're giving a presentation, whether you're interviewing for a job interview, whether you're delivering an executive briefing, or whether you're in front of the CEO of an organization with the CFO and the CIO, and they're evaluating your $50 million proposal, if you can't stay calm, here's what ultimately happens. Right now, Mark and I, we're calm, right? we're using our prefrontal cortex part of our brains. This is where we're smart. This is the thinking. But when we get stressed, this part of the brain literally shuts off. The amygdala kicks in at the base of the brain, and that's responsible for freeze, fight, or flight. And that's where the nasty enough happens. That's where somebody asks you a question and you yell at them and they're angry at you for a month and or you say something you don't mean in a fight with your spouse. So yeah, that's the key why we try to train all of these things. And yes, I advise it, I recommend it, and I teach it to people too. But I've spent a lot of time, effort, and money on these skills for that reason.
Let me tell you this way, Scooby. I like to approach situations like what you mentioned, not with the intent to build job security for me, but what I'm looking to do is build relationships. I want to build eventually trust. And the reason I mention that is while you can be close to the source of providing income for the company, it doesn't necessarily guarantee you, though, that they'll keep you around. And I'm going to use this example. Let's say you have a counterpart of yours, generally is going to be like a sales account executive or account executive, depending on what type of organization you work with. They can do fantastic for a year or two. They can hit all the quotas. Anything that they forecast eventually gets committed and they get the deal done, right? The opportunity always gets closed out. Believe me if I tell you, there's such a huge turnaround when it comes to, unfortunately, our sales counterparts. Even though they have hit for 2-3 years all the quotas, as soon as they stop hitting those quotas for a few months, if they have not built up rapport, if they have not built a relationship with their management team, and then also with the different stakeholders and the different management groups within the corporation, they're going to get let go. Even though they're so close to it. But if you can humanize yourself to these people, show them that they can trust you. And when I talk about trust, I'm talking about that they believe that you will meet the expectation of what was promised or what you told them was going to happen. If you can build such a relationship with the stakeholder, and to me personally, it was always more important to do that with my customers as well, with my clients. Even if it was clients of the company itself, if I was working with them, I consider them to be my clients. I wanted them, the stakeholders, to look at me and say, we trust Mark. And then eventually they'll assign you the title of trusted advisor. Somebody that they can go towards that's not going to be biased in regards to only wanting to do what the company always wants, but does what is best for them, meaning you have the best interest in heart for them. So I would suggest to keep the politicking out of it and focus on helping other people get what they want. If you can help other people get what they want, you will get everything that you want as well, by extension. That's the golden rule that we generally always talk about, right? Treat people the way you want to be treated, and you will get what you want because you have helped them do this. Mike, many times, and we have training around within our program too that deals with the idea of reciprocity. And I'm sorry if I butcher that. I always get a little tongue twisted. But people want to do also good things to you because you have done them to you, generally speaking, not everybody. But again, that mentality needs to be right. Don't do it because you have a selfish gain to it. Do something unselfish and other people will reciprocate to you.
Exactly.
Let's take a look at our next question here. And this is from Cloudy. They're wondering, could you please help me wrap my head around the similarities and differences between anonymization and pseudonymization? No offense, everybody. I hate anonymization. I always get tongue twisted with it. But Claudia, we touched earlier on the anonymization part, right? This is something, is any type of information that we're going to take, and we're either going to change up the information, remove it. So some way we're going to alter it. The key there, though, is we have nothing that links it back to the original information, meaning we cannot reverse the actual process. There's nothing that identifies anymore the data to anyone in particular. Now, pseudonymization, similar concept, but just like I mentioned the previous concepts, you have the ability to reverse it. Because what we're doing there, we're replacing the information with fake information. So think about, I'm giving a fake name, a fake driver's license number. I'm giving a fake, well, in this case, not address, let's say social security number. It's just fake information.
Mhm.
But on the back end, and let's hope we have good security controls in place for the original information, it gives us an ability to eventually have some type of trace back to that information. Sometimes you'll hear the term metadata, right? Data of data. That could be an example of that. But the key distinction between them, again, is anonymization. You always want to think about it. I cannot change it back. I cannot get back to what that information originally was. With pseudonymization, and you mentioned earlier also with direct identifiers and things like that, not actually direct tokenization, you can reverse the information back to what it originally was. Let me know if that clears it up for you, or if you want us to see if we can give you a couple of additional examples on that. In the meantime, let us take a, do we have any more questions, Tyrone? We do from Scooby? Okay. So the question is, finding your niche seems important to relate with colleagues and shareholders. Yes?
I'd say finding your niche is the key to happiness and life success. And what do I mean by that? There's so many things that we can do. But if we do what doesn't make us happy, we're just not going to be happy. I went to school for 7 years, had an internal medicine office, and had about my 8th call with an insurance company, fighting that day with an insurance company to get my patients something that their insurance was supposed to pay for. And one day I said, I can't deal with this anymore. And I just went home and I said, I don't care that I've got a $150,000 education and I spent 7 years. I hate it. What do I want to do? I love taking care of sick people. And then I thought maybe I'll volunteer and still practice internal medicine as a volunteer sometimes. And the rest of the time I'll do something else, which I did what I love, which was tech, because I loved it. And the best part of being in tech is if you have a good job, meaning you've got a good set of skills, like we talked about, you can pretty much carve whatever path you really want, especially if you find yourself in a good company. You know, my path was like, okay, it was Mike, get your leadership skills. When I had my leadership skills, it was Mike. Do you want to work with IBM today? Do you want to work in healthcare? Would you like to stay in banking? Where do you want to go? Because I built my niche. My niche was always delivering, having happy clients, having very satisfied people that worked for me, a team of people that delivered, a team of people that got promoted, and I always brought the people with me. That was my niche. Did I do something different than the next architect on the team in a different way? I sure did. And the other architect on the same team at Cisco had their own way of doing things. But because they were good and because they always delivered outcomes to the customers that always worked, you know, whether it was me and it was schmoozing with clients, which is what I preferred to do, or it was the other guy that preferred to stay up until 4:00 in the morning and try to do 30% of it on his own and outsource the rest because he was more comfortable with that. We both got the same results and we were both respected. And then it was like, okay, well, this is a bigger deal. This is higher visibility. This one takes more executive presence. Bring Mike. And then I might get a call and say, you know, this one's a little more on that direction where he's more skilled than I am, and to send him. And we both did it back and forth. So finding your niche is key because it's a long time to do something you don't like day in and day out for the rest of your life. And we can't remove stress. I mean, fine, quit your job. Okay, now how do you pay your mortgage if you have a mortgage? How do you pay for your food? How do you pay for your cars if you've got a car payment? I don't know. I just don't know. And that's really the secret. So you got to find what's going to make you happy and do it. And when you love what you do, you're going to have energy, enthusiasm, passion, excitement. You're going to be so good at it that you're going to get promoted.
Yeah. And Scooby, I will put it this way. The reason to find your strengths or your unique abilities and you upskill in them is we as human beings, we like things that are similar to us. It helps us to relate to it. We have a natural bias towards things that we understand. You know, they always say what we don't understand, we tend to fear. So if there's somebody who has a different skill set, maybe they communicate a little bit different. Maybe they have a, you know, I always say I have an accent, you know, because I remember people always telling me I had an accent.
Mhm.
Some people like it, most people find it not so appealing, right? It's different. They don't know if they can, and here's the key word again, trust you as much. It all comes about eventually down to trust. If you can relate with somebody, if you have similarities, people tend to just trust you. It's just in us. And if you can do that with the right people, like you mentioned, your colleagues, or even more importantly, let's say those stakeholders, those shareholders, the people that are going to cut you the check, they're going to give you the budget, the people that are going to keep you around because they trust you. That's where the niche really comes into it. There's many other aspects depending on exactly how you're being viewed. At times you also have to work on being credibility with what we generally call intimacy. Intimacy is this idea of learning about others, relating to them, understanding what makes them tick. Doesn't always have to be the actual personal things, meaning you don't have to learn the minutiae things like where did they have a honeymoon and things like that, but simple things like, do you know their children's name? Do you know the wife's or the partner's name? These are things that build trust that we have in people. So again, it comes down to relationship building, especially in the architect role. Okay. Before we move on, Mike, let's go address let's address this last question from Scooby. It's a little bit more orientated towards career, not so much with the security, but I think this is important for anyone that if they have anything in the back of their mind, I think they can stop them from achieving it. So Scooby's concern is he's wondering, does bankruptcy affect your background check in the industries of related to architects' positions?
Not really. So, I mean, I've had someone that had a felony conviction that was in jail for 8 years that we actually ultimately got an architect job for, but this person was exceptional and it was more challenging than others. Look, if somebody had a problem and they got into financial trouble and they went bankrupt, generally speaking, it's no big deal. Nobody cares. That's why the bankruptcy law is here. No, there's two sides of it. If I had someone that had a death in the family, had a divorce, went to the hospital, got a medical bill, they ran up a bill and they went bankrupt and then they started their new life again, who cares? Nobody cares about that. Now, if it is a person who intentionally defrauded investors for tens or hundreds of millions of dollars and then somehow declared bankruptcy thereafter, where it's a criminal kind of thing, like Bernie Madoff, for example. Now, that's the kind of thing where it's going to get in the way of your background check, but not someone that ran into a financial issue. Look, people come from all walks and all aspects of life and can build incredible careers for themselves. But no, that's not something you need to be considerate about, unless you're Bernie Madoff, in which case that would be another story, in which case there's usually jail time and things like that. So no, don't worry about anything like that. Let's get back to the content.
Yep. And before we do, everybody, just a little quick reminder, Tyrone is going to put for us a link in the chat box that in regards to our webinar that we have, if you're interested in learning about the cloud architect career in general, feel free to sign up for it. We'll be there to answer specific career questions in regards to that career. We can spend a little bit more time on Zoom, get off mute, put your camera on if you like, and have more of a discussion about it. It's a little bit more bi-directional, makes it a little bit more personal than what we can generally do on a platform like YouTube. But in any case, it's been, what are we looking at? About an hour and 45 minutes almost. We're doing fantastic. If you can give us all again, it's #CCSP. Lets us know that you're primed and ready for our next topic in regards to policies. And if you're following along in the study guide, we're going to come to page 400, nice and even, and we're going to pick up from that. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, so we're going to talk about policies. And, I'm an architect. I write a lot of documents. Thankfully, AI can help us write more documents a lot faster in a lot of cases. And we will be dealing with a lot of policies. We may not code. We may not configure. We may not do DevOps. We may not do Python. We may not touch Linux, but we definitely do a lot of policy writing. So I keep this in the back of your mind. And the role of policies are going to basically take strategic management goals, and they're going to get them out so people follow them. So will be policies from the security posture of the organization. And the goal here is to reduce exposure, minimize the risk of financial, data, reputational losses, any kind of losses along the way. So that's why we're kind of dealing with these kinds of things. Sorry, I've got 4 monitors and sometimes it's hard to see which one is on. So you may hear an information security policy. We may have a data classification and data usage policy. Of course, we have an acceptable use policy for the use of our systems. We will typically have policies related to software, malware, and every other thing so far. We will have disaster recovery and business continuity policies. We will have policies on how to manage various vendors, because in an enterprise, we could have 200 vendors. We will have policies on incident response and forensic policies. So we're going to be writing a lot of policies. Now, when we start thinking about our policies and drafting these policies, and, we're going to have an emphasis on policies that are related to access controls, data storage, and recovery. So, kind of think about that. We will have traditional IT policies for hardware management. And that may not be feasible for the cloud because we don't have hardware that we're managing in the cloud, or very little. Maybe it's just the connectivity gear, the communications gear to the cloud. We will often need to control certain aspects of shifting to cloud providers. We will have to deal with, when we're on the cloud, we're dealing with remote access. So now we may have password management, for example, encryption. We may have to think about the separation of duties, for example, for administrators or system people migrating to the cloud as a means of security. Now, we may also be looking at audit reports, because it's not like we're going to go to Microsoft's or Google's or Amazon's data centers. They're not going to walk us through. And our auditors can't get in, and the cloud providers can't be busy all day, every day, just letting you in and letting everybody else in. Here, look at our stuff. So when it comes to audits, there's the concept of SOC reports, or Service Organization Control Reports. And cloud providers will be running their own audits, and they will be sharing it with customers. So when it comes to SOC reports, we have the SOC 1 report. And this is going to be the most common type of report you'll typically see. And it basically is providing assurance to customers regarding for financial audits. Now, we may deal with SOC 2 audits, which are going to have much more detailed testing. They will evaluate confidentiality, integrity, and availability controls. They will often contain sensitive information. So SOC 2 information is like, oh, we noticed something here. It's a weakness. It's here. They're not going to be publicly shared. Now, we may also have something called the SOC 3 report. And that's basically going to be the SOC 2 report. But we're going to make it only high-level information. So it'll take what's in the SOC 2. It'll summarize it, sanitize it, so it could be shared for public consumption. So when we talk about SOC report types, let's talk about that type 1. It really is describing the controls that are going to be in place. It includes the auditor's perspective and opinion on the suitability of the control, but it doesn't really check its effectiveness. So if you think about a SOC 1 report, somebody audits, yeah, it looks great. But it looks great, but nobody tested to see if the controls are effective. By comparison, a SOC 2 report tests these things. So it includes opinions on control. It provides results of some testing. So it gives some information that is meaningful. All right, let's talk about cloud vendor management. It's an entirely new context. So when we're in the cloud, it's going to be, we're going to be managing vendors. And when you think about the importance of vendor management, it's going to be very critical for managing risks and making sure vendors do what they're supposed to. It'll be essential for planning critical business processes and sensitive information. We may have enterprise risk management, and managing vendor relationships is going to be there. So we're probably going to have some enterprise risk management program. And inside of that, we will have practical tools and techniques that we can actually use to build stronger vendor relationships and make sure they're doing what they're supposed to claim to be. Now, I mentioned a little bit about some complications with regards to cloud computing. And cloud computing is really about decentralized and geographically distributed technology. The data, the storage, the computing, they could be all over the world while you're using it. So it makes it very hard to assess controls. We also have these trans-border complications because you never know where your cloud stuff is going to be, what country, what level of regulation, where it's going to be. And resources that you see today are going to be reallocated, reused constantly and frequently and moved around. So it's going to be very hard in most cases, unless you request certain things like a dedicated host, where it's going to be pretty hard to even know where your stuff is or where it's being moved around, at least in an area, because hardware is going to be moved and pulled. So that makes it a little more challenging from a legal perspective. It really does, because all these jurisdictions can have various laws. So we always have to account for these legal risks. We need to maybe get our attorneys involved, and we need to think about governance structures for our organizations. So when we architects are helping to design a governance structure, and whether it be the governance of the implementation or the governance of the long-term management, we have to really, really go back up to that high level and make sure we've got people on the legal team, people that understand these rules and regulations and every part of that governance structure. We need to make sure there's a very good degree of communication between the cloud's customers, the providers, and all of the vendors. And I don't want you to ever think it's like in an AWS solutions architect professional that's actually architecture. It has nothing to do with it. Not only is it systems administration, not architecture, but it makes you think there's one vendor or two vendors. Hundreds and hundreds of vendors going on in an enterprise. So lots of these things that are going to be going back and forth. And an organization security policy framework is going to be a series of a whole bunch of documents. And the scope and complexity are going to vary widely based upon the organization's nature, the type of information. So when we talk about a security policy framework, we're going to talk about policies, standards, procedures, and guidelines. And they sound similar, but they're not. There's subtle differences between them. A policy is a broad statement of management intent, and compliance is mandatory. Everybody using email to patients inside of this health system will use a secure email. Will use secure email. So I might then have I might specify what's considered secure email, but we have to do that. And if it's coming from the CEO and the people don't follow the rules, they can be terminated. So typically in a cybersecurity policy, there's going to be the importance of cybersecurity of the organization. There's going to be a requirement of all staff, contractors, all employees to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information systems. There'll typically be a statement of ownership of the information that's being created or processed that it's owned by the organization. There will typically be a designation of a chief information security officer or someone that's the equivalent. One person that's pretty much at the C-suite that's responsible for security. When it comes to, there should be an approval process, and to add things, whether it's buying something or what have you, or changing something. And that usually that approval process has to go from people who are never requesting it all the way to some manager, could be even be the CEO. And there should be some fairly broad wording with a little bit of wiggle room to give that chief information security officer the ability to adopt security requirements, because businesses change, technology changes, the global environment changes, the macroeconomic environment changes, the microeconomic environment changes. And if our technology people can't be adaptive with what's going on in the business world, these systems aren't going to serve much purpose. So that's a policy. Now let's talk about a standard. A standard defines mandatory requirements that will determine how to implement our practice. So this is the content of this is typically specific. All operating systems will be Red Hat Enterprise Linux 8 point whatever. They will be locked down and have these XYZ packages, something like that. We may have controls to protect highly sensitive information or any other security objectives in a standard. Under a standard, There needs to be a process for approvals or changes. So maybe something's approved at an organization level that's lower than the policy. So for a standard, maybe it doesn't need to go to the CISO. Maybe it can go to the VP of security, which means standards are going to change more frequently. The standard golden OS build may be this today. Wait, 6 months later, there's a problem identified. We've not got a new golden OS build for the new server, something like that. And organizations can adopt their own standards. They can adopt external standards, or they can look at other standards that other companies are doing and adopting them for themselves. So we talked about standards, we talked about policies. Now, what are procedures? How do you do something? So a step-by-step guide. Now, why would an organization come up with a procedure? Well, I want you to think about it. If you approach the same task the same way every single time, the chances of your outcomes being good, if your procedure is good, are excellent. If you don't, and one day you do it one way and another way you do it another way, you've got a problem. So you may know that when an airplane pilot walks into a cockpit of the plane for that day, there's a big checklist of things they have to check along the way. And they did that because they found that pilots are smart, highly educated, well-trained people, but half of them wouldn't test certain things, or they'd test what they wanted, forget to test something, and when there was an emergency, they had a problem. So they implemented checklists, and they've had much safer flights. There's a procedure at Mass General Hospital on how to do open heart surgery. And by doing it, they've reduced the number of negative outcomes. So when you come up with a procedure, compliance mandatory, which means somebody doesn't follow the procedure, they could be terminated. Now let's talk about some procedures that you're going to see in policy frameworks that are kind of common. We can have a monitoring procedure, which describes how security monitoring of things are performed. And this may be continuous monitoring, for example, we might want. We may have procedures for evidence collection. We may have procedures on how we want our systems to be patched and the frequency they want to be patched and the way the patches should be tested before they get put down. So this brings us to the elegant world of guidelines. And guidelines provide best practices or recommendations for specific concepts, technologies, or tasks. Now, guidelines are not mandatory. It's suggested this is the best way to approach something. So it's kind of helpful advice. So there's a degree of optionality in here, and that's going to vary based upon the organizations and its cultures. Now, let's say you put all these controls in place. You've got all this new security policy. Do we think we can always use that same security policy and it never needs to change? That's not going to work. So we're going to have a means for exceptions to the policy. So we need a mechanism, what to do when we have to do something outside the compliancy. Maybe it's a business reason we have something to do. And this is going to be necessary for unforeseen circumstances that are going to require you to deviate from the normal procedure. And we need a policy framework for should any kind of specific requirement specify receiving an exception. So we need a way to do this. There's an exception coming in, and what do we do about it? Now, one of the things we typically can do when we need an exception is we can use some form of compensatory control. And this is a temporary exception to the security requirements. Maybe it's used for remediation plans, but we've got something to do. So think about that. Let's say you create an environment. For example, when I used to see patients, I had my patients coming in. They were scheduled 9 to 5. All of a sudden, there's a semi-emergency. It's not straight to the ER, but it's urgent. I prioritize that patient. I take that patient and maybe do some things in the office that I wouldn't normally do in case they shouldn't have come to me in the first place and it was an emergency. It's an exception to the rule. Maybe I've got someone that needs to be on site for a couple of days. They are coming from a trusted company. They need greater than normal level of privileges, but we trust them and we have to give them what access they need. We do that. It's an exception. So hope these things kind of make sense. And we want to make sure that whatever policies we have are going to best align with existing mechanisms. So we want to coordinate cybersecurity policy efforts with existing policy developments. because we want a smooth transition and integration between policies. So, how do we create policies? What are some good principles to do it? Well, one of the reasons you always hear me talk about stakeholder management and architects is if you need to create a policy, you need to get input from the stakeholders in that organization. You have to engage the relevant team leaders and find out how their teams will be affected by the policy. Because if you create a bad policy and you bankrupt the business, you didn't help them. So you want to make sure that all voices are heard, and you may not get a consensus. And not everything is going to be consensus rule, and that's okay. So don't think you have to. There's also going to be a chain of command, and you need to follow it whenever possible. So understand if an organization has a formal and an informal information structure, navigate governance lines, and do so appropriate. Some organizations have a very strict chain of command. Pretty horrible, pretty strict, and they need to be because they're so big. Other organizations like our organization, Go Cloud Careers, we're kind of loose. We're kind of loose because I've got a team of incredible people. I only hire the best of the best of the best, and they're creative people. So I want them to have the freedom to go do what they need to create, and we'll talk about it together. But we're small, we're nimble, and I'm beyond selective in who I bring into my family. And that way, the people we have, I can let them be great, let them be themselves. You never know what happens with a guy like Mark. You give him some time and autonomy, and he's as smart as he is, he'll come up with something pretty incredible. So, that works in a small business. In a big business, you need structure. And big business have various chain of commands for that reason. So we also have to accommodate in our policy for organization culture. You have to tailor policies to fit. So they have to align from the tone of the leaders. If the leadership wants something one way, they do something one way, and they expect it one way, that's the way the policy should be. In line with that culture that the leadership's trying to create. If I say I want a policy of openness and I'm a CEO of a company, and then I tell everybody that in order to find a meeting with me, they need 14 management approvals to get there. Do I have a culture of openness? So we have to make sure that if I want a culture of openness, the people that are creating the policies are creating these policies of openness. If I want a policy of critical security, then I want to make sure those people are following it. So we also want to make sure that we meet any policies we have that meet any internal governance needed as well as external governance. So we don't want to have any contradictions. If the policy has the company trying to do things that are illegal, that's obviously not going to work. So at some point, we've got to create this policy. Creating this policy is like creating any other architecture. We've drafted the policies. They've gone through the organization's approval message. Now what? It's a new architecture, a new technology project, a new policy. We've got to go communicate that policy to the rest of the world. We've got to get those affected individuals excited by the policy, bought in and ready to go. And that's why sometimes when you see new technology rollouts or new policies, they have a big party. They have appetizers and wines and hors d'oeuvres, those kinds of things, because they're trying to sell people into adopting the policy. And then the management has to get in line. We also should talk a little bit about enterprise risk management. So we have to understand cybersecurity risks. And these are things like reputational, financial, operational. And we've talked about a lot of these things before, but a risk can be anything from a data breach to a natural disaster. And I know we've gone through this the whole time, but we're now a little more focused on risk management, where we touched it on business continuity planning. We touched it briefly on disaster recovery planning. So when it comes to risk management, we have to identify the risks, which we talked about, determine the severity of the risks. And remember, we talked about how to calculate each risk. And then we pick a risk management strategy. So I want you to think about this. The initial round of risk management is going to lay down the foundation of your company's security policy. We're going to have repeated risk management efforts. And the key is we're going to be proactive and constantly try to improve the organization's risk profile. The primary objective for a business of risk management goals is to reduce risk, to whatever has been deemed acceptable for that business. And every business has a different level of risk. Now, that acceptable level can vary hugely from organization to organization. And what's acceptable for one will not be acceptable for another. I'm also going to make it clear, achieving a completely risk-free or 100% safe environment is impossible. So please understand that, although we can substantially lower the risk. So the key here is to apply risk management controls to reduce this risk. So when we're dealing with risk management, we've got, realistically thinking, it's going to be divided into two areas: risk assessment and risk response. And whether you're planning executive protection for a dignitary and you're going to do this risk assessment, whether you are preparing an organization's risk, we have to examine the existing environment for risks. We have to evaluate the likelihood of each threat's occurrence. We have to evaluate the severity of damage should an event cause, and evaluate the cost of countermeasures. So if I had a protected dignitary in this stadium, right, and I had a stadium, I'd look at the risk. The risk are the people sitting in the pictures. The risk are hidden spaces that I couldn't see. The risk could be a tall building where I could have a sniper on the roof. The risk could be the ingress and the egress points on that field where you could come in and take a hostage, for example. The risk could be someone in the audience. We have to evaluate all those risks, and then with executive protection, you mitigate those risks. Now, in cybersecurity, it's no different. We're evaluating all those risks that exist, and then we're determining how do we protect it. So let's think of risk responses. They could be countermeasures, like safeguards and security controls. We'll be using cost-benefit analysis to verify various risk mitigation approaches. And when we look at our findings, we're going to consider all the conditions, concerns, and prioritizes when we make a response. So the first thing in risk management is, what is our assets? What are we protecting? The source code for a multi-billion-dollar AI application? That's going to be protected. R&D on a new drug? Yeah, that we need to do it. An organization's data and forecast? A proprietary business process that makes a business good at what it does? That is a huge asset. So the next thing we have to determine is, what's the asset value? Now, I love this little girl. See, this is my little cat, Cindy, but what do you think a photo of her is worth? To me, it's my little baby girl. I was sitting on the sofa and she hit on the windowsill behind me in the sofa and the window. To me, she's worth anything. But to a normal person, it's a cat that I rescued for $35 or $50 or whatever it was. So a photo of her is not that valuable. Now, I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to spend $10 million to protect that Cindy the cat photo, because the asset isn't that valuable. My cat's valuable to me. That's another story. So I evaluate, what's the asset's valuation? What's its cost to develop? What's the asset's cost to purchase? What's the asset's value to the business? What's the asset's value to the competitor? Because if it's very valuable to the competitor, I still have to protect it. What's the intellectual property value? What damage will occur to the brand if the asset is damaged? So if I know what I have and I know what it's worth to me, then I have to evaluate all the threats. So what are the ways that I could be attacked, that a bad actor or action could cause harm? So what are those threats? And they could be deliberate threats. They could be unintentional threats, those types of things. So when it comes to threats, let's talk about threat actors. These are your bad guys and gals that are trying to hurt you. That's a threat actor. It could be a mugger on the subway. It could be a thief running into a store with intention. That's a threat actor. A threat vector would be how the systems are attacked. So, are they attacked via Wi-Fi? Are they attacked over an email worm? Some attacker plug in a USB stick? And then we have to think about vulnerabilities, which are weaknesses in the system. So, I kind of think that's going to make sense to you. So, threats are the things that we face, the risks. The threat actors are the people that want to attack you. The threat vector is how they would attack you. And vulnerability is the weaknesses inside the system. So I think we should talk about exposure. And exposure is really the risk of loss or a breach if anything is susceptible to the attack. So this doesn't mean that the event needs to occur. It's just that knowing what harm will cause if it happens. Maybe we stop here. Looks like a couple questions popped in. Answer them, and then we'll go back to the content.
Okay, everybody can hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Sorry about that. All right, let's tackle SR's question. If I work as a cloud security architect, I am fine with it. But if I'm asked to solution some projects, I find it difficult. How do I improve my solutioning or tech capabilities if I do not have any? A practical experience, such as by vendor's tech prescription. Mike, I'm gonna let you answer that question, but from the actual, like an actual architect. And then I'll address it from the perspective that many people have when they apply to jobs, let's say from some of these cloud vendors and what they perceive architects are supposed to do.
Yes. So here's the key. A doctor doesn't have to have a heart attack to know how to treat a heart attack. A doctor doesn't have to be a drug addict to know how to take care of drug addict patients. We're talking about a theoretical world versus a practical world. Having a whole bunch of hands-on experience building things teaches one nothing on how to design things. You give me a hands-on engineer, I give them a 10-minute interview, and I can show you that they can't do architecture at all. Likewise, you give me a distinguished cloud architect, and you put him or her in front of a computer and ask them to write a Terraform script, and they're going to have a panic attack. And they're going to run out the door because they don't know how to code. They don't know infrastructure as code. They don't know how to touch technologies. So how do you design these things? How do you go from one thing to another? You have to get education. You have to get training. You don't learn how to do surgery by watching YouTube videos. You learn how to do surgery by understanding normal anatomy, understanding the body, understanding how every process in the body works, how every organ works, how every organ's connected to each other, and where you can open and where you can close, and ways that you can do it in a safe manner, ways with minimal blood loss, ways with minimal exposure to infections. Because if you had to make it up yourself, lots of people would die along the way until you figured out how to do it. Nobody is taught in a certification, how do I design something? There's none. Even the only certification out there right now that has anything to do with architecture is the Cisco Certified Design Expert. And believe me, there's no training out there for the CCDE that's actually teaching architecture. It is a completely different thing. So you want to pass the CCDE exam, you do a little bit of an MBA because you're going to have to give presentations. You do a little learning here, you do a little learning here, you learn a learning here. So you can never use vendor prescriptions. If you use a vendor prescription, that's basically letting somebody Mark, I've never met Mark. Just present, I've never met Mark. Mark, thanks for coming to my office today. I've got an appendectomy, and I have that we need to do on you, a tonsillectomy and an adenoidectomy. Why? Because I made a prescription before I ever met Mark in the first time. Now I do that. I'm going to make a ton of money by billing insurance companies until somebody locks me up and puts me in prison, which they would need to do, as well as taking my license away. So if an architect actually goes out there with vendor prescriptions, they're no different than a doctor saying you need surgery without saying it. So how do you deal with it? You learn the underlying technology till you know it to no end. You learn how every piece of this technology works, and you learn how every piece of the technology fits together. You get taught the business skills that you need to understand business. You get taught the leadership skills that you need to have. You get taught the executive skills that you have. And now you're in an architecture. I'm not designing an architecture by myself, because if so, I can tell you it's going to be all networking and it's going to be all security. I design an architecture and I build an architecture team. And now my architecture team has a data scientist, it's got an AI architect, it's got a security architect. And if I'm the chief architect, I bring in a network architect, even though I can do the job, because I can't focus on the network in the big picture. I bring in an IAM architect, I bring in some DevOps engineers, I bring in application architects, I bring in software developers, I bring in cloud engineers, network engineers, security engineers. Why? Because they know their job better than I do. And by getting all of them together, I can say, Mark, the organization needs a 99.999% solution. The organization has a private cloud and a public cloud. But Mark, they told me that they're going to have 15,000 VLANs. And Mark's going to say, okay, 15,000 VLANs. I can't do that with the traditional VLAN approach, right? But Mark, is there a technology that you know of that can deal with a large number of VLANs in a data center? And if so, what is it?
It's EVPN. Basically, we use in VXLAN, and it's 16 million VLAN identifiers. But here's the key. Before Mike goes on, I answered as an engineer just would have answered.
Yes.
Normally, my question would have been more in regards to what are you really trying to accomplish? Where are we trying to go? What do you currently have? This would have never come out of my mouth immediately if a customer asked me like that. I would have turned it around and tried to figure out a little bit more what they're really trying to accomplish. Because I'm not simply there to spew facts. I got to apply the technology eventually to a business use case. Go ahead, Mike.
And that's the key. The reason Mark was able to answer that is because Mark knows so much about underlying network and underlying network infrastructure and how the network infrastructure, he actually knows his architectural options. And then he would be able to figure it out. So that's the difference between a technician that's used to doing something and an architect. You have to evaluate all trades. I'll give you a basic thing that is going to be so basic, and I'll actually share it. I'm going to draw it out for you, and it's going to be so basic, but it's going to show you the difference of thinking like an architect versus thinking like an engineer. And I'm going to put something technical on here. Bear with me for a second. I'm going to draw it up, and then I'm going to actually share it to you. Bear with me. But no, the real key is you're going to have to be trained. And if you're not trained, it's going to be like getting in the cockpit for the first time. And so let's say we're over here. Bear with me 1 second. I went to host. So Tyrone, I'm going to want you to share. Actually, no, I don't need to have you share it. Tyrone, put me single screen for right now. And then I'm going to share. Okay, so in this particular environment, I drew something very basic. And here's what I have. I have, let me put this, I've drawn almost everything. So make this, let me take this cloud, get rid of the cloud. Let me put a text box in here. OSPF area 0. And you can all answer this question in the chat box. So my web server is sitting over here. My web server has the IP address 192.168.1.9/24. Here's my web server. While we're at it, here's going to be the IP address of the gateway. And I bet most people get this wrong. And I want to show you that it's the thinking pattern that's different. The host is connected to this router. The host can connect to this router and reach this router. This wide area network subnet over here is 172.1.1.1/30. So it's an IP address that's going to be a /30, which again is totally fine. Bear with me. I'm going to set this up for you. I'm going to put another one on the other side, .2. Okay, so right now, if you look at this environment, all of my routing is enabled. I've got 2 routers that are both in an OSPF domain. I've got a host, and the host can right now ping across this network it can reach this web server, it can access this web server, and its traffic can come back. You all with me so far? So everything is working. Now, we talked about packet filters and we talked about routers. So on this link, I'm going to create an IP access list that says permit TCP port 443 from any destination to 192.168.1.9. So on this particular interface, and I'll draw the arrow, I put this access list that says, hey, by the way, allow any traffic from any source. I actually should say any source, not destination. To 192.168.1.9. So on this interface right here, it actually permits any web traffic from the host to the web server. Is this going to work? Will the host be able to reach the web server? If the answer is yes, the ACL permits it. I'll pop in yes, because the ACL permits it and it worked before we put the ACL on. But if you don't think it'll work, tell me why it won't work and put that in the checkbox. I'll leave it up on the screen for you for a minute. And this is the difference between architectural knowledge versus engineering knowledge. I gave you some time to think about. It worked before we put the ACL on, and all we permitted on the ACL was the web server reaching port 443, because this web server is answering on port 443 SSL. Will this work? If the answer is yes, put it in. It worked. I popped in an ACL on that router on that interface. It worked prior to it, and the ACL will permit the web traffic going into that website. Should it work? Okay. Any answers? Why or why not? The ACL permits it. Will it work? Now, Mark knows the answer right now. What is the use case of this? This is every single IP network where you might have an access list. James A., we never blocked the default gateway. Chad, we are allowing port 443, so it should work. SR, it won't work. Why? Access list permits it in, not blocking anything. Why isn't it going to work? Or why will it work? SR, you understand that. You're understanding the architectural piece. So why won't it work? I'm permitting web traffic in. It should work. Well, here's the reason it's not going to work. See, on this interface over here, I allowed the web traffic in, but an access list by default denies all traffic. And you know what this access list is going to block? It's going to block the OSPF traffic, which is the control plane traffic. And because it blocks the control plane traffic, what'll happen is this host will connect to this router, and it will never learn about the this subnet. Oh, sorry. So let me make sure that I'm back. So I'll show you why it won't work. Let me make sure I'm back on the screen. So in this particular environment, the reason it won't work is, yes, we've allowed, I must have picked the wrong one. So yes, we've allowed all the web traffic into this interface. The web traffic is permitted, no problem. But when we applied that access control list on the interface, what we accidentally did is we blocked the OSPF protocol, which is what is going to tell this router how to reach this subnet. And because this router won't know how to reach this subnet because we blocked OSPF at this link, we took our entire system down. So ACL permitted it in, but if the person didn't understand the routing protocol and the person didn't understand that the routers along the way have to have a keep alive between them every 10 seconds, and they have to send a hello in between them, and how the routing protocol worked, the system's just going to come crashing down. And that's really where we go wrong, because people think I can configure an ACL all day long, and they're right. I have hands-on experience. It's great. Now I need you to design something. And now I need you to design something that you've never even heard of or thought before or even know that it exists. And you're not going to know what you don't know until you have somebody teach you these limitations. I hope that helps. Did that give some people the holistic nature of what this was? Where we block one thing and poof, we actually damage something else, something else, something else, and something else. That's why Mark and I have to think about the entire big picture. What connects to what? And we have to understand everything. It's the same thing every time I write a prescription. Okay, somebody came in, they have high blood pressure. Okay. If they have heart failure, I want to start with an ACE inhibitor and typically a beta blocker because it'll increase cardiac output. But if that person has asthma and I give them an ACE inhibitor, they're going to cough, and that may exacerbate their asthma, as would the beta blocker exacerbate that asthma. So in this particular case, maybe I use an angiotensin retention blocker and a diuretic. If I don't know medication and I don't know diagnoses and I don't know all the underlying factors, I can't make any of it. So that's why technician-oriented labs, click, 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 how to, will ultimately teach you zero on how to design. And that's why, as much as I love engineering, it really doesn't prepare you for architecture, because it's teaching you to do what's in front of you. And architecture is taking a step back, evaluating that big picture, and how does that network impact that security, which impacts that server, which impacts that storage, which impacts this, and they're all together. Hope that made sense.
Yep. And SR, I'll briefly mention it also from this perspective for you. Since you mentioned a key word to me, which means we're not talking about the architecture that generally Mike and I would be referring to. You used vendor. So that means to me that you might be looking at job descriptions of the nature of the typical solutions architect roles that you'll see at a lot of these cloud providers. What you need to understand about those type of jobs is that they're glorified technical sales jobs. And what I mean with that is that it's really a sales engineering position. And I don't mean that in like a derogatory term or to belittle the position, but in that type of role, you are more technical than you are business savvy.
Yeah.
So generally speaking, you have engineers with a technical acumen come out of the bottom ranks, and they'll get into that position because they're very technical, but they're missing, generally speaking, a lot of the sales acumen, meaning that sales training. So in those type of roles, if you find yourself there, let's say you're a decent mix. Generally speaking, usually your engineering is a little bit better than your sales and your business acumen in that sense. But if you find yourself in those roles and you're struggling when it comes to the technical aspect, the reality is you're going to have to sit down and you're going to have to learn the technology that your company is actually selling. There's no way to get in front of a customer if you're doing a discovery call, you're trying to find out the details, or you can come up with a demonstration of the solution if you have zero idea about how the technology works and actually how to use it, because you're going to have to demonstrate to the customer based on the pain points, this is what the technology looks like, this is how the technology is going to solve your problem, and this is not just going to be PowerPoint slides or a public lecture or a speech. You actually have to understand how the technology works. And in a lot of those cases, what will happen is, unless you have some type of internal engineering team that might be specifically assigned, like if you think of a company as large as IBM, well, they have sales architects, and then underneath them, they have more specialized architects or engineers that deal with the particular feature or sometimes a particular technology, right? Outside of those, if it's you're going to be sitting with people that are more business-like. So think about the CTO, the CEO, etc., like the CXO suite. But you're also going to be with people that are more technical. And because you're going to have those type of people with you, and you're not going to have the backup as of the other engineers with you, you will have to explain to them the nitty-gritty details of the solution. Again, that requires you to train up, learn your solution, see how it functions, and of course, be prepared before you demonstrate a solution.
Yeah.
And one key
And that,
aspect in those type of roles, and the same thing, I think Mike will agree with me, well, even in what we consider an architect role, is you need to be conscious or aware of when it is time to help and when is it time to sell and when is it time to actually solve a problem. Because so many times what happens is, if you're in that type of solution engineer or solution architect role, your first instance is, because you're so technical, is to simply tell them how to solve the problem.
yeah.
But when you're there to find out what the problem is, it's not the time to solve it. It's the time
Yeah.
to help. So, go
And
ahead, Mike.
and what Mark's referring to is the technical solution architect, which is not the solutions architect. So the solutions architect is more businessy, but some companies like Cisco have a group of architects called technical solutions architects. They're sales engineers. They also have architects that do things like me that would be considered enterprise architects or vertical industry. They've got a lot of architects. But when you find an engineer that's gone from engineering that somehow got their first architect job and somehow they did it without architecture training, one of two things happens. Either that person gets fired within the first year because they can't sell and they're not meeting the number and they're terminated. That typically happens. And I'd say in a percentage of the cases, the people that try to just make the jump from engineering to architecture do the job for 6 months, they're miserable, they don't know where to begin, and then they quit before they get fired. Some of them actually have done that. They got there and they're like, oh, okay. And then they go to training and then they get to training and they're successful. I have seen that too. But unless you're trained on big picture thinking, unless you have all those business skills, when a company has time and they say they have to lay off 10%, and your architects with good business skills are bringing in $50 million of sales, and your engineers that got promoted are doing $2 million of sales, your $50 million architects are getting promoted, the $2 million salespeople are getting laid off, and a day after that layoff, they hire a new set of people that can do sales. Like if you looked at Cisco's third layoff this year, they did a massive layoff, and 2 days later, they were hiring all these sales positions. So you really have to learn these jobs, because my always perspective is, if I walk on an interview and I wow them because I'm the best there is, and a principal architect at Google pays $394 to $677. If I walk in there and wow them and they love me, I'm earning $600. If I walk in there and they don't love me because I'm not as skilled, I'm walking in there at $394. That's a lot of money to leave on the table. I'm going to go in there and I'm going to prepare like my life depends on it. I'm going to get the best training I can. I'm going to spend money for training I don't even have. And believe me, I promise you, I spend a few $100,000 more on education than most people have. And I'm going to do that so I can walk in there and I can wow them. But that's the reason. It's that big picture thinking. But anybody can learn it, and that's the beauty of it.
Yeah. Tyrone, we're going to move on to the next question, but I just wanted to address what SR said too. He said it was practical. It was a practical project related to encryption and hybrid multi-cloud scenario for technology enablement. In either case, if you are in charge of a particular solution, we're not talking about, when we describe architecture, we're talking about an end-to-end system design that includes everything. Solutions, we're talking about a particular technology or a set of technologies that the vendor you're working for is selling to a customer. So in this case, you would still have to eventually come up with a shadow environment. We discussed that yesterday, where you would have a staging environment and basically a production environment. In that staging environment, you would use that as a demo to demonstrate how that particular solution that you put together solves the customer's, let's say, 3 to 5 pain points. So you still will have to understand how to build that environment and how to demonstrate it, and you will have to understand how to troubleshoot it. Because
assuming you're not an architect.
Yeah.
If you're an engineer, like a pre-sales engineer, what Mark is talking about is true. A sales engineer, yes. Once you cross that bridge to the solution architect, now you're having the engineer build that and demo it, and you're managing the relationship. And if you don't, and you choose to build it yourself, and like Mark's saying, there are some people that choose to build it themselves. They don't do it every day, so it's not going to be delivered as elegantly. You're no longer focused on that client and selling your product. You just became the techie technician that's going to go build it, which means your client won't have the same degree of respect for you or think about you the same way. And the chance of you delivering a successful demo and a presentation and having the management think of you as a trusted advisor is slim to none. So, yes, as a sales engineer, I did exactly what Marks did. And in my first solutions architect job, I demoed it. And then I saw my buddy Daryl, and I saw what Daryl did, and I saw that Daryl's revenue was 3 times mine. And I was like, oh, well, Daryl, there's a reason your bonus is triple mine. I'm not wasting my time touching this technology again. I'm going to buy the lunches, dinners, and drinks and bring in the engineers. So, yeah, keep that in the back of your mind.
Yeah. And so, as you notice, we're talking two distinct, different types of architects, right? The one that Asar is describing is more the pre-sales architect, pre-sales engineer type, while what we're generally discussing, like here, security architecture, we're talking about the planner, not the actual person that is building the technology or demonstrating it. So, but let's go on to the next question. We still got a couple, and then we'll get back to the content. So a question from TY. Is it easier for someone with a governance, risk, and compliance background to, I assume you're asking if it's easier for somebody with that type of background to be able to transition to a cloud architect? They mentioned they see similarities from some of the things you've mentioned about cloud architecture careers. So I'm going to give you my answer, and then I'll let Mike expound on that. The answer is simply yes. It is simpler for you to transition. There's going to be a minor difference. Unlike your previous role that you're going to be, let's say you have that background in the governance, risk, and compliance. All that still applies to cloud. Guess what? All of that still is going to apply to anything that is networking related or that's IT related. But the amount of focus that you're going to be spending on it is going to change slightly, depending on what kind of company you're working in. Because of how specific, like you mentioned, there's roles specifically for the governance, the risk, and compliance. You already might have somebody in that organization that deals specifically with that. So in that case, what really happens is you take a back seat and they will become your advisor, your consultant in these matters.
And here's the thing. After training architects and having them work everywhere, I'll tell you the easiest people to transition. They are salespeople, they are medical professionals, and they are anyone who is a planner in their job. Salespeople, because salespeople are always asking about projects. They're used to RFIs, RFPs, RFQs. They're used to presentations. They have the business acumen, the leadership in most cases. So with a good sales rep, what we have to teach them is the technology design. And it takes them about 8 months to learn the technology design, typically speaking, and they've got a lot of the business things, so it's just an enhancement. I will tell you, nurses, doctors, and attorneys are the next easiest, and here's the reason why. They're used to asking a whole lot of questions. They're asking to examining evidence, making a plan diagnosis and a plan to a certain degree, so they are simple. Now, they have to learn the tech, but they also have to learn some of the business piece, but they've got a lot of those sales skills and empathy and emotional intelligence, which yields well for these careers. And they're used to doing their research and knowing how to find quality research. Have I had people that were waiters become? Sure. Social workers become sure. Nurses become architects. Teachers become architects. I will tell you that it is not easier to go from engineering to architecture. I've trained them. Now, when I have an engineer that wants to move to architecture, they have to learn the business piece, the communication piece, the leadership piece, the sales piece. And then we typically have to take the engineer, and the engineer brings some of the best technical expertise in the world. So we have to get that engineer to stop thinking like an engineer, to stop thinking about the technology and then focusing on the business and the business goals and leading the teams. Now, if I can take an engineer with good engineering experience, get them to think and say, I am no longer an engineer and I'm not going to act like an engineer, and I can take all that great technology and then I can still teach them all this business. Now, that's the ultimate combination. But I will tell you from experience, the engineers usually have the hardest time moving into architecture roles. The engineers that have the easiest time in cloud roles typically are infrastructure engineers, network engineers, for example, and data center engineers, because they're used to doing it. But it doesn't matter. Noah Parker was a social worker before he got hired. Vladimir was a 24-year-old college student. Ivan Tamba was a waiter. Daniel Bosa was working at Nordstrom before JP Morgan Chase hired him. Jennifer was a mental health tech. It really doesn't matter. But I will say, the more business and leadership and sales that are in your career, generally speaking, the easier it is.
All right. Let us take a look at our next question. And this is from Sei or Sei. I apologize for mispronunciation. But you're wondering, false negatives. What does it mean and how does it work? So false negatives basically means that there was a threat, but whatever system you're using in your threat detection didn't notice it.
Yep.
So what we basically want to do there is we want to have additional detections in place. So for example, if we use, let's say, signature-based detection, meaning we're looking at patterns that correspond to a particular attack. And let's say your system did not detect that pattern or the signature that would be a company associated with a particular attack. We have other detection mechanisms like behavioral and anomaly that will potentially be able to catch those type of attacks. We generally call this some type of defense in depth because of the different detection mechanisms. But very simply, that's how it works, and that's what it is. It's a real threat that simply was not recognized by your system. And then generally speaking, multiple levels or different type of detections, or what you want to have there is you might want to also work on having different vendors, perhaps, depending on the type of signatures or definitions that they allow you to be able to download and that they can basically do pattern matching on. Some are better at detecting some things, others are better at detecting other things. Now, I will say this, though. If there's some type of zero-day attack that nobody knew about, the chances that any of these three detection mechanisms will catch it is a little bit slim. You would have to go with something like a anomaly detection mechanism that is maybe connected on the back end, let's say, with the machine learning, so that it can actually figure out what is general behavior going to look like and build a baseline, so that anything that goes out of the baseline automatically might be pulled into a sandbox environment. So think of it like an isolated environment where it can be studied, it can be taken apart just to see what's going on with it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And I want to get to, I'm going to do Scooby Dale's question because I want to address it before it gets taken out of context.
Okay, go ahead.
And
you want me to read
not
it
that
first?
one.
For the
No,
audio?
if engineers are difficult to work with, because it's not that they're difficult to work with. I'll tell you why they have the difficult challenges, but put up the question. Tyrone. So the challenge with engineering is not the engineers. It's the focus of our job. So how many people actually we're looking at the ACL that I put in that example, and we're looking at the ACL's impact on the web server? I bet almost anybody that's ever been an engineer, because that's what an engineer is trained to do. They're trained to focus on what they're actually working on, and they have to be good at their job. So, for example, when I stuck that ACL in the web server, Tyrone, share this. What Tyrone's going to share is this is functionally what I was talking about. We were looking at that web server. It's the engineer's job to look at that web server because they're focused. We all focused on this squirrel. Now, I told you that architects have a different way of thinking. They have to go high level. They have to see everything. And architecture is about seeing all the stuff that's not directly in front of you. What is the impact of the one change on the entire system? Tyrone, share my screen again. Because always what's going on is when that engineer is focused on that thing that's directly in front of them, and the engineer has to be deep. It's required for their job. They have to be super smart. It's required for their job, but they're focused on that squirrel. They're focused on that web server and that application because that's their job. But while they're focused on that, they can't see that there's this terrifying little Cindy over there that's trying to eat the squirrel. And the architect thinking has to focus on the big picture. The engineer has to focus on what's in front of them. And that doesn't mean the engineer's not awesome. They're awesome. It means that if you've been trained to look at what's in front of you all day long, and if you've been trained to focus on the technology, and now your job is to take a big picture approach, and now your approach is focusing more on the business, then every single time you see that tech in front of you, you want to go look at it because it's what you're used to. It's what you're good at. It's what you're comfortable. But now you got to go focus on that big picture, and it's hard. So the engineers bring some of the best experience with them. They really do. But unless you can break that habit of focusing on the tech, you just engineered your architecture solution, which is like you had the airplane mechanic flying your plane. And it's not their expertise to fly the plane, it's the airplane mechanic to fix the seats. So it's about applying the right tool for the right job, the right person to the right project. That's all it is. Engineers are awesome, but it's not, that's the reason. Because it's a new way of thinking, it's a new way of acting, it's a new way of living, it's a new way of working.
Yeah, let me add this to Scooby. You yourself are in a position where many would consider you to be an engineer. I've of course been there, done that. Mike has done his, placing his toe into the water and decided that was not for him, and he got out of it quick. But I want to tell you this: everyone you work with, from let's say the janitor all the way up to the CEO, every single one in your organization has a particular talent. Absolutely. I personally, anyone I ever work with, even if it's not directly, sometimes even indirectly, I always consider all of them rock stars because they show up and most of the time, 99.9% they deliver. When it comes to engineers put a lot of work in to hone their skill, to get really deep into the technology. They understand how it works. They also understand what it looks like when it doesn't work, right? That's where the troubleshooting skills come into place. They perform fantastic under pressure. When things go sour, they got to go fix it in a minute, trying to get it back up. So the approach you want to take with people like that have put that much effort into it, they're going to have pride in what they have accomplished, in what they have learned, and what they're capable of. It is always good practice to give them respect and give them the attention that they deserve for being rock stars when it comes to being technical. Again, they say you get more. You get more bees. No, you catch more flies with bees than you do with vinegar, right?
I think it's more with honey with the vinegar. Yeah,
honey with vinegar.
Both of us.
I always get these things backwards. But the idea is, be honest, be flattering though, because they'll put their work in, and then they'll be reciprocating with you. Communication skills aside, that is a total toss-up. I've seen some that are great, other ones I need a translator. But in either case, give them their due, give them the respect, let them explain themselves. And when I mean let them explain themselves, they might go down the deep end trying to explain something to you. Let them explain it, ask some clarifying questions. And that requires exactly what you said. It's this idea of emotional intelligence, which is going to couple with leadership skills.
Yeah.
So just keep that in mind. All right, let's take a look at our other questions. And this is from Scooby-Doo. It says, if developing policy and if there are similarities to other companies, can policies be proprietary between related companies and industries? Is this something we must familiarize ourselves with? So the things that will be familiar are going to be frameworks or guidelines that companies use. For example, there's another question in the box that deals with in regards to, let me see if I can find it quickly, because I can find it right now, but related documents in regards to NIST guidelines. So what will happen is you might go to company A and then go to company Z, right? So different companies, and they all might be looking at, let's say, the cybersecurity framework that NIST brought out. And they might choose to use certain aspects of that framework to build up their policies and their security posture. So it is likely that you can go from one company to the other one and see similarities there. Now, there are going to be instances, though, as you go into a company like that. So either as an employee, let's say as a consultant, when you're going to be the architect, there's going to be policies and the way things are implemented and the way things are done that might be proprietary to them. We generally call this for them to have some type of competitive edge compared to somebody else. But you're also talking then also with proprietary information to begin with. So in those cases, you generally are going to be required to sign an NDA. You can't take the information with you. And that's a conversation, I believe, you might correct me, I think we had yesterday in regards to also what you need to do with people when they go that high up and what kind of security measures you need to put in place.
We definitely
but there's a distinction yesterday, right? So there's a distinction between using frameworks and guidelines and then trying to take advantage of some competitive edge that another company has.
Yeah.
Okay. And Tyrone, can you pull up the next question where the person mentioned NIST guidelines? I think it was SR. So SR says, for developing a cloud security policy for federal government, what are related documents I have to take as guidelines? Are there NIST guidelines? Number one, they're just guidelines.
Yep.
You don't have to take any of them if you don't want to.
Exactly.
They're just suggestions, just recommendations. If you use them or not, that is going to be in the end your decision. Okay. But what I'll do is, because I did this throughout the last 9 days, I put a couple of links in there. I'm going to, let's see, how can we do this? I'm going to put a couple of NIST publications in the chat in a little bit once we get back to. Well, actually, Mike, did you want to cover any more content today?
Initially I was going to, but realizing what time it is, let's just fully answer the questions we actually have.
Okay. So
and I'll be
what I'm going to do is, so let me do this. I'm going to put them in the chat. So pardon the typing when you hear me, but one of the publications is going to be NIST, and I'm going to put this in. It's going to be 800.144. Okay, that's going to be one of them. And then the next one, let me look at my list, is going to be 800/145. NIST SP, there's going to be 800/146. NIST SP is going to be 853. So the first three are going to be specific to cloud security. So we're dealing with defining cloud characteristics, how to use them, security and privacy in the public cloud. The last one I put in there, the SP 853, that is specific to the cybersecurity framework. I believe it's version 2.0 right now that is put out. And then there's also another one that you can look at is 800/210. And this has to do with access control. And then, just give me one second, NIST.
Good resources, Mark.
Yeah, let me see what this one in particular is. So this is NIST SP, and this is going to be 800/207. Okay, and that one is going to deal with zero trust architecture and that type of framework. So those are a lot of things that you can take a look at. There was many other ones. NIST has also a great risk management framework. I don't remember top of my head what the. Let me see if I can find it for you. NIST. Let me see what it is. And then I'll provide you with that as well. All right. So this is for the NIST risk management framework. And that brings you to a page where you have multiple documents that are going to deal with a particular risk. And for everybody, by the way, copy and paste this into a document and go look it up, because these are going to be very helpful, not just for the examination, but also for real world, because you can dig into guidelines and standards, and they help you understand also some of the thinking patterns that architecture should have. So when you're designing systems, this might be a good way to go about reading them. And if you're learning, guess what? You can learn actual design based on whichever particular framework you're going to be looking at. All right. Do we have any more questions, Tyrone? If we do, let's go take a couple more questions. Okay. From NP, wouldn't you have different access control lists applied to different interfaces? For control and data, assuming there are switched virtual interfaces or sub-interfaces. And NP, you would not apply, in this scenario, access control lists towards your control plane. No. Because what Mike was demonstrating is, again, and it depends on where you apply the access control list at, and if it's an inbound and if it's an outbound facing access control list. But really what the problem was, what Mike was demonstrating is, you would have to understand how an access list is constructed and that it's read from top to bottom. So if I go into an access list and all I do is I permit a particular TCP port or the application associated with that port, by the end of the access list, there's going to be a deny all statement. Yes. You would actually have to look at the ACL to see that statement. And depending on where you apply that particular ACL, so if it's applied further inbound, generally we try to apply, and when I mean inbound, closer to the destination of where the packet is trying to go. But if I apply closer to the source, which generally you would try to do, apply the ACL as close to the source as possible, What would happen on the other end, if I applied it by the destination, I have to explicitly allow any type of protocol that needs to communicate with that router or with that switch. So in this case, it wouldn't have mattered if he had switch virtual interfaces or if he had sub interfaces and had VLAN, basically .1 queue encapsulation. It wouldn't have mattered because it would depend on where he assigned it, and then also if he made sure that any other protocols were allowed.
Right. And the whole point was showing that if you're in an environment and all you know is the technician approach of where to put an ACL and how to read an ACL, but you don't know that there's an underlying control plane, even though you see OSPF. And if you don't know that OSPF would be blocked by that access list, and if you don't understand that if OSPF is blocked, routes won't be propagated, so this device won't even be able to find it and the traffic would be dropped. That was the whole point, to show engineering is that ACL. The architecture is thinking about the impact of every one of these things. So where could we move it? How can we move it? What would we do? Why would we do? And it takes that holistic knowledge of it, which is just not taught and not learned by just building stuff and hoping that along the way it doesn't work and you figure it out and you learn something. That's just not the way that you do these kinds of things.
And again, if you're in a relationship where you're the architect and you have engineers working with you, if you're working with a good engineer, that engineer would generally kind of check you. What I mean with that is whatever designs you come up with, the engineer would have to be in the clear on how actually to accomplish it.
Yep.
And if it's something that's not feasible to do, then he would come or she would come back to you and advise you, hey, listen, this is not something that we can actually go about doing the way that you thought we can. We need to make some adjustments. Or in the case of what Mike was showing you, the engineer will be cognizant of the fact of what the actual implementation details would be. Now, if you were, let's say, a network architect, then in your low-level design, this is where you would have your details. You would actually specify what device and what direction that access list will be under, and for what specific protocol. And at the same time, you would also then lay out what other protocols need to be allowed or denied. So, but then you're talking about you're more a specific architect with a specific type of knowledge. We're talking about just designing and architecturing a specific domain. It's not going to be basically end-to-end system design, right? It's going to be basically just networking. So yes, your knowledge is going to be a little bit deeper as an architect in that sense. All right, let's take a look at what other questions we have for today. From Mufasa, they're wondering, what about customer success managers? Are they easy to transition?
It all depends what the definition of customer success managers are, and that could be one of 1,000 things. There are some people that are involved in customer success, specifically at tech companies that are considered customer success executives. And what happens is an architect like me would design it. And after I design it, they might assign a customer success executive. And that executive may make sure that there's leadership of the engineering team that's going to go build it. And they may work with the service delivery executive to make sure the resources are aligned. That customer exec person would have extra communications going back to the account team, so that something not go right on the deployment, they can get the sales team back in. That customer success person would have the ability to raise or escalate a level internally. If they're struggling with the technology during the build out, that they could actually change things. For example, that might be something they would do. That customer success person, if things are going wrong, might be able to create some customer solutions, be able to arrange alternative solutions to the organization. So a lot of relationship building, a lot of relationship development, and a lot of leadership, and a lot of orchestration. That customer success, in many cases, is a lot like post-sales architecture. But the person still needs the architecture knowledge. But there's other forms of customer success that are a little bit different. So it kind of depends on what you're doing. I almost took a customer success director role at a company, I guess it was about 5 or 6 years ago. The CEO pulled it as soon as COVID started. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to create a team of industry experts. They were experts at designing solutions for various industries. And they wanted to model it after the Cisco Internet Business Solutions Group, which is where I came from at Cisco. And their whole point was, we'll just call it customer success because that's what you guys really do. Is it's strategy, it's consulting division. That feels like customer success. And we're like, okay, I don't care. Call me anything you want. But it was actually as an enterprise architect. So it all depends on what you're doing in the role. But generally speaking, the better your communication skills are, the better your ability to be creative, to be able to take a whole lot of information, look at the information, analyze the information, and develop a plan based on the information, the more your job is already like an architect. But it doesn't matter where you start. It matters what training you get. I promise you, I didn't know how to practice medicine in my youth. I guarantee you, I was not born knowing which prescriptions to write for which conditions. I also didn't know how to select which wide area networking technology. I didn't know how to architect a demilitarized zone. I didn't know how to build a business case. I didn't know how to create an ROI model. I didn't know how to calculate the net present value and the future value of an opportunity. I didn't know how to architect a data center, but I learned because I got education and I got training. And that's really the secret.
All right. Let us take our final question for today before we wrap up. And that's going to be from John O. They're wondering, upon starting a new role, what additional steps can we take beyond participating in the organization's training program to effectively integrate into the environment as a cloud architect?
Okay, so John O, congratulations at your great job offer at this incredible company. John O, I have your email in front of me, and you point that employer to me, and I will give you the best reference you can possibly imagine because it's been such an honor to work with you, assuming you're the John O that I think you are. I may call you Addy for a second. I think that'll probably help because I know you're from the Addy. At least I was thinking you're one of the Addies. So, okay. So the first thing I would do when I join a company like you're going to join is go out there and meet people. Go to the office, go talk to people, take some people to lunch, take some people to the pub, have a couple of drinks with people, and really build your relationships because that company you're going to has a lot of people in every part of the world, and it's all going to be about relationships. When you hang out with people and you take them to lunch, use your corporate card because you want to build some relationships and your company will happily pay. Ask them who the go-to people are. And, when I got a real wacky thing that I need this, here's the go-to person for this wacky little data loss prevention thing. And here's the go-to expert on SIEM. And here's the go-to expert on this, and try to build your database. And then I'd encourage you, John, and I thought it was you, and I would encourage you, John, to go out there and build these relationships. At the same time, when you're in meetings, as soon as you figured out where you're at, and your manager will sign, okay, we've got this project, who's interested, and here's what's going to happen. Everybody's going to try to hide under the table, put their heads over their body like my cat if she was scared. I can do it. I can do it. I can do it. You volunteer. And you volunteer for the biggest, scariest, most high visibility things that you got. You show your manager you're willing to get in there and you're willing to do it. By doing it that way, you've already know the people you're going to work with. You're already going to build your team, and you're going to show that you are not afraid of anything. That's it. You go in there and you conquer. But when you go in there, really focus on those relationships, John. I know you, so it's not you. Don't step on somebody else to get ahead. When you do that first architecture project and they give you credit for it, because when you're the chief architect or the lead architect, you got credit. Somebody writes you a nice email, you respond back and copy their manager. Thank you so much. The reason I was successful was this person, this person, this person, this person, this person. And you'll still get the credit, but now you're sharing it. And then you go out there and the people that helped you along the way, you talk to their management, you show them how great they are and how appreciative they are. You get them bonused or promoted, and you'll have a team of allies for the rest of your career. So that's what I'd suggest, John. And I think you're going to do great because I know you and I know your knowledge. And I know your networking, your security, and your cloud knowledge because I've had the honor and privilege to get to work with you. And good to see you, and congratulations on that big job.
Yep, congratulations again. I'm briefly going to touch on a question. Tyrone, you don't have to pull it up, but it was from a user named MP. They were asking what domains were covered during which days. So that everybody understands, the way that we structured the lessons was not based on covering one domain and then the next one and so forth. The way it was structured is that we took a topic. Like, for example, today we covered governance, risk, and some compliance. Then we went into cloud vendor management. So for example, on a cloud vendor management, we cover parts of domain 1, which is cloud concepts, architecture, and design. Then there's also some coverage from domain 5, which deals with cloud security operations. And then, and again, as we wrap up tomorrow, you'll see a little bit more of that, but we also covered some aspects of domain 6, which was legal, risk, and compliance. So what I would suggest in this case, MP, is once the bootcamp is actually completed, we're going to be adding timestamps to the various sessions. And that's going to make it a lot easier if there's a particular topic or subject that you were looking for you to be able to find it via the timestamps and then click on it. But just understand is just to make the learning easier, we combined the different domains and the subtopics under these domains as they're going to fit into a larger topic, like in this case, vendor cloud management. So just keep that in mind. But aside from that, everybody, can you guys give us a hashtag CCSP? You guys did fantastic. You have wonderful questions. We really have seen the growth over the past 9 days where everybody's mentality, the way of thinking has shifted from give me the details to more understanding how do the pieces fit and what are the pieces compared to, for example, how do I implement the pieces? So you guys have been fantastic throughout the days. We're going to do a wrap-up session tomorrow, some more content that we're going to finish up. And overall, I sincerely hope that everyone has enjoyed it. We're definitely thankful that you guys have taken the time and the effort of being here. I know it's not always easy, especially over a period of 10 days. But in either case, the last thing that I'll mention, then I'll hand it over back to Mike, is if you want to, we'll put a link into the description box as well. Go ahead, if you have more career questions, sign up for the webinar. Once that webinar comes around, you'll be able to come off mute, put on your camera if you like. We can have a personal one-on-one, well, sort of like a one-on-one virtual conversation and answer a lot more questions. Aside from that, Mike, do you have any closing messages?
Yeah, so a couple things, some housekeeping, those kind of things. So Mark and I went a little above and beyond answering questions today. We didn't keep to our strict times, and here's the reason why. I'd say we've got 90 minutes to 2 hours tomorrow. So we really love answering questions. We really wanted to give you the opportunity to really help you get to your goals. So tomorrow we probably have an hour and a half. So Mark and I are probably going to be liberal with questions towards the end of it tomorrow, because I really want to make sure that, you invested 2 weeks. I hope that we gave you some good training. I know we spent a lot of time, effort, and money in putting this together. I know you guys have questions, and if we can guide you, and even if it's just to point you in the right direction, if that's going to take what it's going to get you to be successful versus non-successful, I am excited and happy to do it. It's a privilege to be able to do it, to be in the position to have helped so many thousands of people over the years, and I'd love to do anything I can to help you. I'm joined here by Mark, and Mark is I think you can exactly tell how deep he actually is and how far he actually goes back, which is why he's our Chief Technology Officer. He's got a lot of other skills too, but, that's a place where, he's always adding to what we do. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. We'll finish the content. Feel free to ask us other questions you want on this content. We got 10 days of content. So if you've got questions on the content, Mark can get pretty geeky for you, and I'm happy to do it. It'll give me a chance to stop talking, and I'm totally happy for that. You want some career or some business stuff? I don't care. I'll get to it as well. I just want to make sure we gave you a great time. Give me a hashtag CCSP. I'm excited to see you all tomorrow. And then we did a CISSP. Who knows? I wonder if we'll do some more security stuff coming soon.
You'll have to. Okay, let me see if I can get this YouTube spiel down correctly. Hit the like button if you enjoyed the content, and as well as if you'd like to see more security content. At the same time, to be aware that more security content might or maybe might not come up, make sure you hit the notification bell, because for some reason, YouTube is horrific at notifying. I don't know why, but that's just the case. And something a little bit more important is we believe in paying it forward. We have had the opportunity, we're fortunate enough to be able to put together training and provide it for free for people. And we hope that if you've enjoyed it and you have the same spirit that we do, go ahead, share the videos with those people that you think can take advantage of it. And hopefully there will be many more videos to come. In either case, we'll see you all tomorrow, 2 p.m. sharp Eastern Standard Times, and we'll get into some of more of the details in regards to how to manage cloud vendor engagement. And then we'll finish up with just a general Q&A. It could be about certain topics, career, whatever you guys like. In either case, thank you very much, everyone. I wish you a good evening, good morning, or good afternoon, wherever you might be.